Ancient Mesopotamia. The Sumerians and Babylonians didn't just build the first cities, they built the first recorded systems for dealing with people who broke the rules of those cities, and the results were as brutal and pragmatic as you'd expect from a civilization running on forced labor. Dating back to around 3000 BCE, Mesopotamian prisoner treatment is among the earliest we can document, largely because they wrote everything down on clay tablets. The Code of Hammurabi, carved around 1754 BCE, codified 282 laws governing everything from theft to debt, and prisoners fell squarely into its reach. Two categories dominated: prisoners of war and debt prisoners. War captives were enslaved immediately and assigned to the hardest labor available, hauling stone for ziggurats, digging irrigation canals under the scorching Mesopotamian sun, working agricultural land for temple complexes. They had economic value, which paradoxically kept most of them alive. Killing a healthy captive was wasteful. Debt prisoners were a separate class. Civilians who couldn't repay loans were detained in what Akkadian texts called the Bit Asiri, roughly translated as the house of bondage, until their debt was worked off through labor. Their families could be seized alongside them, held as collateral in a world where a missed harvest could cost you your freedom for years. Ancient Egypt. Egypt presents one of history's great contradictions in prisoner treatment, a civilization obsessed with order, record-keeping, and cosmic justice that nonetheless sent thousands of human beings into mines so lethal they might as well have been execution chambers. For most of Egypt's roughly 3,000-year history, there was no dedicated prison system in the modern sense. Confinement was short-term, a holding stage before punishment rather than the punishment itself. What Egypt did have was the Kenneret, a labor colony, part workhouse, part penal settlement, where convicted criminals and captured foreigners worked under armed guard. But the truly feared destination was the gold and turquoise mines of Nubia and the Sinai, particularly the brutal operations at Wadi Hammamat and Wadi Alaki. Workers sent there were shackled, fed minimal rations, and expected to work until they dropped. Very few returned. Papyrus records, including the Anastasi Papyri, document runaway workers, men so desperate they fled into the desert rather than continue, which tells you something about the conditions they were fleeing. After major military campaigns, foreign captives appeared in long columns in tomb paintings, wrists bound, being marched toward a life of temple servitude. Rameses II, who ruled from 1279 to 1213 BCE, left records boasting of thousands of Hittite and Nubian captives put to exactly this use. Political prisoners could expect mutilation, the removal of ears or the nose, as a permanent mark of disgrace before or instead of confinement, a punishment documented in New Kingdom administrative texts. Ancient Greece. Greece gave the Western world philosophy, democracy, and one of the earliest known purpose-built prison structures on record, the Athenian Desmoterion, meaning literally the place of chains. It didn't use that structure the way modern societies use prisons. Imprisonment in ancient Greece was almost never the final punishment. It was the waiting room before exile, execution, or a fine. The most famous occupant of the Desmoterion was Socrates, held there in 399 BCE before drinking hemlock, with Plato's account in the Phaedo describing his final hours in that cell. A site in Athens has been tentatively identified by archaeologists as the Desmoterion, though the identification remains debated. For common people, the conditions were grim, dark, cramped, and rife with disease, since ancient Athens had no concept of sanitation infrastructure for prisoners. High-status prisoners, however, could receive visitors and relative comfort, making the experience deeply unequal. Sparta handled prisoners with a different kind of ruthlessness. The Cryptia, a shadowy institution that functioned somewhere between a secret police force and a state-sanctioned killing program, allowed Spartan youth to murder helots, the enslaved population, who displayed too much strength or courage. Being a Spartan prisoner of war wasn't a formal category so much as a temporary state before disposal. Athens did produce one meaningful reform. Solon's laws of 594 BCE abolished debt slavery in Attica, prohibiting the imprisonment of Athenian citizens for unpaid debts, a genuinely radical shift at the time, though one that applied only to citizens and not to the vast enslaved population. Ancient Rome. Rome industrialized prisoner suffering in a way no civilization before it had managed. The Carcer Mamertinus, a two-chamber underground stone dungeon beneath the Roman Forum, served as the most infamous political prison in the ancient world. Its lower chamber, the Tullianum, was a pit carved directly into the rock, accessible only by rope from above. Enemies of Rome, men who had once commanded armies and ruled kingdoms, were lowered into this pit to die. Jugurtha, the Numidian king who had defied Rome for years, was starved to death in the Tullianum in 104 BCE. Vercingetorix, the Gallic chieftain who nearly defeated Julius Caesar, spent 6 years as a prisoner before being strangled there in 46 BCE. But for the bulk of Rome's prisoner population, the fate wasn't a famous dungeon. It was damnatio ad metallo, condemnation to the mines. Silver mines in Spain, copper mines in Cyprus, gold mines in the Balkans. Prisoners were sent there in chains, worked in conditions of near total darkness, fed just enough to keep working, and expected to die within a few years. Roman law technically held jailers responsible for prisoner deaths in custody, one of history's earliest formal prisoner protections, but enforcement was effectively non-existent. There was one category of prisoner who received something closer to professional care: the damnati ad ludum, men condemned to gladiatorial combat. Housed in training facilities called ludi, they were fed, given medical attention, and trained by professional instructors, not out of compassion, but because a well-conditioned gladiator put on a better show. Ancient China. The Qin dynasty, which unified China in 221 BCE under the first emperor Qin Shi Huang, created the first comprehensive imperial legal code in Chinese history, and that code treated imprisonment as one component of a precisely calibrated hierarchy of suffering. The 5 official punishments, tattooing, cutting off the nose, amputation of a foot, hard labor, and death, were graduated by severity, with 2 hard labor with imprisonment sitting in the middle. This wasn't vague sentencing. Surviving bamboo strip legal records discovered at Shuihudi in 1975 show prisoner ration tables, daily work quotas, and explicit penalties for guards who allowed escapes, all written out with the same bureaucratic precision the empire applied to tax collection. The labor itself built history. Prisoners worked on the Great Wall, the Apang Palace, and the vast mausoleum of the first emperor, projects requiring hundreds of thousands of workers, with casualty figures estimated in the hundreds of thousands, though exact numbers remain debated among historians. The Han Dynasty, which followed from 206 BCE, softened some of the most extreme physical mutilations, substituting penal servitude for amputation in certain cases. But perhaps the most psychologically devastating feature of the Chinese system was collective punishment. The principle of jujutsu, by which a serious criminal could bring imprisonment or execution down upon every relative across 9 degrees of family relation. Being caught didn't just mean your own end. It meant the end of everyone connected to you. Ancient India, the Arthashastra, a treatise on statecraft attributed to Kautilya, advisor to the Mauryan Emperor Chandragupta around the 4th to 3rd century BCE, contains something genuinely remarkable: what amounts to an administrative manual for running a prison. It specified that Bandhanagra, the state prison, should be built near the edge of cities with separate sections for men, women, the sick, and the disabled, a level of institutional organization unusual for any ancient society. Prisoner rations were calculated to sustain, but deliberately not to satisfy, and torture for confessions was explicitly described as a tool available to officials, with specific techniques outlined with the same matter-of-fact tone used for agricultural policy. What makes the Mauryan period particularly interesting is the reign of Ashoka, who took power around 268 BCE, after the Kalinga War, which by his own inscriptions killed roughly 100,000 people and left 150,000 displaced. Ashoka converted to Buddhism and implemented what his rock edicts describe as prison reforms, releasing prisoners on coronation anniversaries, ordering official inspections to limit torture, and granting condemned prisoners 3 days to prepare for execution. Rock Edict number 5 specifically names prison welfare officers. How thoroughly these reforms were implemented in practice versus how thoroughly they were proclaimed in stone is a question historians still debate, but the intention, carving the idea of prisoner welfare into imperial law, was itself unprecedented. Ancient Persia, the Achaemenid Empire under rulers like Darius I and Xerxes stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River, and its approach to prisoners combined administrative sophistication with spectacular public brutality. Darius I's Behistun inscription carved into a cliff face around 522 to 486 BCE at a height impossible to reach without scaffolding, shows the king standing over a line of defeated rebel leaders, their necks connected by ropes. The inscription catalogs what happened to them: blinding, removal of noses and ears, public display, and finally execution. This wasn't just punishment, it was political communication carved into a mountain. High-ranking prisoners, particularly defeated kings and foreign nobles, were sometimes kept alive in the Persian court as living trophies of imperial dominance, housed, fed, and paraded at royal events as proof of Persian reach. Ordinary prisoners and those condemned to labor faced the Angaria system, conscripted work on the royal road network, palace construction at Persepolis, and irrigation projects. The Persepolis fortification tablets, a massive administrative archive discovered by archaeologists, document ration distributions to workers, some of whom were almost certainly coerced, with entries as dry and detailed as a modern spreadsheet. Zoroastrian religious thought, which characterized criminals as servants of the Druge, the cosmic principle of deception, added a spiritual dimension to imprisonment. The prisoner wasn't just legally guilty, but spiritually corrupt, which made their suffering carry a moral weight beyond mere punishment. Medieval European prisons were less a justice system and more a real estate problem. When a lord, bishop, or king needed to hold someone, they used whatever vertical stone space they had available, which usually meant a tower, a basement, or in the worst cases, an oubliette, a vertical pit accessed only through a trapdoor in the ceiling, named from the French word oublier, meaning to forget. The design was the message: you were dropped in, the trapdoor closed, and you were forgotten. For common criminals, imprisonment before trial was standard practice, but long sentences were rare because they were expensive. Jailers ran their facilities as private businesses, charging prisoners for food, bedding, candles, and even the weight of their chains. Lighter chains cost more. A wealthy prisoner in Newgate Prison, established in London around 1188, could maintain a relatively tolerable existence. A poor one, waiting months for a trial date, could die of starvation or typhus without the court ever hearing their name. The Tower of London, begun by William the Conqueror after 1066, became the defining image of medieval political imprisonment, its walls still bearing inscriptions carved by prisoners awaiting execution, names and dates scratched into stone as the only evidence they existed. Torture was not extra-legal in medieval Europe. It was formally sanctioned by both secular courts and the church as a necessary step in extracting valid confessions. The rack stretched limbs to dislocation. Peine forte et dure crushed the chest with increasing stone weights, until the accused pleaded or died. The Magna Carta of 1215 attempted to limit arbitrary imprisonment, establishing that no free man could be imprisoned without lawful judgment, a principle honored far more in theory than in practice for the next several centuries. The Islamic Caliphates. Islamic jurisprudence developed one of the ancient world's most sophisticated theoretical frameworks for prisoner treatment, and one of the largest gaps between theory and practice. The Quran's emphasis on ADL, justice, and the legal principle that imprisonment without charge was itself an injustice meant that Islamic scholars debated extensively about when incarceration was even permissible. The habs, or prison, was officially a pretrial holding space or a facility for debt resolution, not a place of indefinite punishment. In practice, the Abbasid Caliphate maintained something far darker. The Mutbaq, an underground dungeon complex beneath the Abbasid palace in Baghdad, was described in later chronicles as a place of near-total darkness where prisoners were chained in posture too cramped for standing, overcrowded beyond any formal capacity, and left to disappear from the historical record entirely. Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, who ruled from 754 to 775 CE, reportedly used such facilities extensively for political enemies. Prisoners of war occupied a legally distinct category. Islamic law held that they could be ransomed, freed, or offered conversion, not arbitrarily killed, though the actual treatment of war captives varied dramatically depending on the era, the conflict, and the ruler's temperament. For convicted criminals, the hudud penalties prescribed in Islamic law, flogging for certain offenses, amputation for theft, meant that prison was often a brief stop before a very physical sentence rather than the sentence itself, making the Caliphate's carceral system structurally different from both Rome's and medieval Europe's. Aztec Empire. The Aztecs built one of the most formidable military empires in pre-Columbian history, and their prisoner system reflected a priority that had almost nothing to do with punishment in the conventional sense. Long-term incarceration was essentially absent from Aztec society because the point of taking prisoners wasn't to warehouse them, it was to sacrifice them. The Xochitlal, or Flower Wars, were ritualized military engagements fought specifically to capture enemy warriors alive, a practice so institutionalized that battlefield killing was sometimes considered a failure of mission. Captured warriors were held in wooden cages called petlakali, sometimes for months, awaiting the correct date on the ritual calendar. Some were deliberately fattened with food before sacrifice. An offering meant to honor the gods was something of value. The sacrifices themselves took place at the Templo Mayor in Tenochtitlan, the heart of the Aztec capital. Criminal justice operated through a parallel, more conventional system overseen by local Calpulli councils, with specific punishments prescribed for specific offenses: enslavement for theft, death for murder, and short-term detention handling the period between accusation and sentencing. Aztec slavery, the Tlacotan, was legally distinct from the chattel slavery of other civilizations. Enslaved people held legal rights, could own property, and could theoretically purchase their freedom, a nuance that the Spanish colonial sources, biased toward portraying Aztec society as uniformly barbaric, tended to obscure. Imperial Japan. The Roya, the prison of feudal Japan, was not designed for rehabilitation, reform, or even long-term storage of human beings. It was designed to degrade. Conditions inside Edo period prisons were meticulously documented by Japanese administrative records and are genuinely difficult to read. Prisoners were packed into spaces so small that lying down simultaneously was impossible, sleeping in enforced shifts while others remained upright, in facilities reeking of disease and inadequate sanitation. What makes the Roya particularly unusual is that it developed its own internal government, a rigid prisoner hierarchy dominated by the longest-serving inmates who controlled sleeping positions, food allocation, and unofficial discipline, meaning that entering prison meant submitting not just to state authority, but to a brutal inmate power structure, with no external oversight. Official torture, called gomon, was legally required before any confession could be considered valid under Tokugawa law, which ran Japan from 1603 to 1868. Ishidaki, stone pressing, involved kneeling a prisoner on a serrated wooden surface and piling heavy stone slabs onto their thighs, increasing the weight until they confessed or became incapacitated. Tsurushi, suspension by the wrists tied behind the back, produced similar results. Execution methods were highly stratified. Seppuku, ritual self-disembowelment, was reserved for samurai who had brought dishonor on themselves, while common criminals faced beheading or crucifixion at sites like the Kozukapara, execution ground in Edo, which processed thousands of condemned individuals over its centuries of operation. The Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire ran a dual legal architecture that created fascinating tensions in its prison system. Islamic Sharia law governed one track of justice, while Kanun, the Sultan's secular imperial law, governed another, and a prisoner could theoretically fall under both simultaneously. The most storied Ottoman prison was Yedikule, the fortress of the Seven Towers in Istanbul, converted to a detention facility after the conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Its walls carry carved inscriptions from prisoners across 5 centuries. European ambassadors, deposed viziers, and foreign diplomats held during tense negotiations between empires, their names scratched into stone in a dozen languages. For serious criminals and prisoners of war, the Ottoman sentence of choice was kürek çizesi, or punishment, galley slavery, that chained men to rowing benches in the Mediterranean and Black Sea for years, a sentence whose physical demands made survival far from guaranteed. Ordinary prisons, the Zindan, operated on the same fee-based corruption model as medieval European jails. Pay for your food, pay for lighter chains, pay to avoid the worst cell. What the Ottomans added that was genuinely distinctive was the cafes, the cage, a system applied specifically to the imperial family. Princes who might represent rival claims to the throne were confined not in dungeons, but in comfortable surveilled apartments within the Topkapi Palace complex, cut off from education, political contact, and the outside world, sometimes for decades. Some emerged from the cafes to rule empires they had never been prepared to govern. Others never emerged at all. Colonial-era Americas. The European colonization of the Americas produced prison systems that were less formal institutions and more systems of economic coercion dressed in legal language. The Spanish encomienda granted colonizers the labor of indigenous populations in their territory, legally a grant of labor, functionally a grant of people. The obraje, colonial textile workshops operating across Peru and Mexico, took this further. Workers were locked inside at night, beaten for failing production quotas, and bound to their workplace through debt peonage, artificial debts created and maintained by the workshop owners to prevent workers from ever legally qualifying to leave. They were prisons that called themselves factories. British colonial jails in North America mirrored their English counterparts almost exactly, fee-based, catastrophically overcrowded, and primarily functioning as pre-trial holding pens where the poorest defendants died of disease before their cases were ever heard. The debtor's prison represented a particular absurdity, men imprisoned for the inability to pay debts, which made it logically impossible to ever pay those debts, creating a cycle that sometimes lasted years. After King Philip's War ended in 1676, hundreds of Wampanoag and Narragansett prisoners, men, women, and children, were sold into Caribbean slavery by colonial authorities, a fate that represented the outer edge of what colonial prisoner treatment could mean. Britain's Transportation Act of 1717 formalized a system of shipping convicts to the American colonies as bound labor, combining exile, imprisonment, and forced service into a single sentence that removed the problem from English streets while populating colonial workforces. Revolutionary and Napoleonic France. The storming of the Bastille on July 14th, 1789, is one of history's great theatrical moments in the history of imprisonment. A furious crowd tearing down the symbol of royal tyranny only to find 7 prisoners inside, most of them there for relatively minor offenses. The Bastille's power was always more symbolic than operational. What it represented, the lettre de cachet, a sealed royal order that could imprison any person without trial, without charge, and without time limit, was real enough, having been used to confine thousands of people over the preceding century. The revolution abolished the lettre de cachet in one of its first acts. It then proceeded, within 4 years, to arrest approximately 300,000 people across France during the Terror of 1793 to 1794. The Conciergerie, the Luxembourg, and La Force prison in Paris swelled to catastrophic overcrowding. Facilities built for hundreds, holding thousands in conditions where disease moved faster than the guillotine. What emerged from those prisons was genuinely strange, an improvised social culture among the condemned, including dances, theatrical performances, and gallows humor newspapers produced by prisoners who received their execution notices sometimes only hours before they were carried out. Napoleon ultimately imposed order on this chaos, constructing the Maison Centrale network, standardized national prisons with labor requirements and regulated conditions, which became the direct architectural and administrative ancestor of the modern European prison system. He also demonstrated a talent for political imprisonment on an international scale, detaining Pope Pius VII from 1809 to 1814 and executing the Duke of Enghien in 1804 without trial, establishing that even revolutionary states built on the language of rights would find reasons to disappear their enemies. Sumer and early Mesopotamia. The oldest written records of slavery on Earth come not from Rome, Greece, or Egypt, but from Sumer, scratched into clay tablets in cuneiform more than 5,000 years ago. They reveal that humanity did not stumble into slavery accidentally. It was organized, legally defined, and economically central from the very beginning of recorded civilization. The cuneiform sign for a female slave appears in administrative tablets from Ur and Lagash as early as 3000 BCE, listed alongside livestock and grain. 2 pipelines fed the system. The first was warfare. When Sumerian city-states raided one another, captives became property. The second was debt, more insidious because it reached into the free population itself. A farmer who borrowed grain during a bad harvest and could not repay might surrender his children, then his wife, then himself into bondage to the creditor. The Code of Ur-Nammu, c. 2100 BCE, and the Code of Hammurabi, c. 1754 BCE, both treated slavery as a normal, regulated institution. Hammurabi set the price of a slave at 20 shekels of silver and prescribed death for anyone harboring a runaway. Temple complexes in Ur employed hundreds of enslaved workers weaving linen in enormous workshops, their output tracked in the same records as barley harvests. What made Mesopotamian slavery unusual was a degree of legal personality that seems almost contradictory. Enslaved people could own property, conduct business, and sometimes accumulate enough wealth to purchase their freedom. The debt system also had a release valve, the Royal Mishuram Edict, through which kings periodically canceled debts and freed debt slaves as an act of political legitimacy, an ancient jubilee acknowledging the system's tendency to consume too many free people too quickly. Slavery in Sumer was not a footnote, it was the foundation. Ancient Egypt. Almost everything the popular imagination believes about slavery in ancient Egypt is wrong, and the most stubborn myth is the most cinematic, that enslaved people built the pyramids. They did not. Archaeologists excavating the workers' village at Giza, led by Zahi Hawass in the 1990s, found paid laborers who received rations of beef and fish, had access to medical care, and were buried with dignity when they died on the job. The pyramid builders were largely conscripted free Egyptian workers and skilled craftsmen. The actual Egyptian institution was real, but complicated. The word hem referred to a category of dependent worker that scholars struggle to translate cleanly, because the line between slave, serf, and low-status dependent blurred in Egyptian practice. The primary source of genuinely enslaved people was foreign conquest. New Kingdom pharaohs, particularly Thutmose III, whose campaigns in the Levant between roughly 1479 and 1425 BCE reportedly brought back tens of thousands of captives, fed foreign bodies into Egyptian households, temples, and labor projects. Enslaved Nubians were especially common in homes and armies. Conditions varied enormously by role. A skilled enslaved scribe in a wealthy Theban household lived in a world utterly removed from a forced laborer in the gold mines of Nubia or the copper mines of the Sinai, which Diodorus Siculus later described as places so brutal that death was preferable to survival. The Ptolemaic period after Alexander's conquest brought Greek rulers to Egypt beginning in 305 BCE, layered Greek chattel slavery concepts onto Egyptian tradition, hardening what had been a more ambiguous set of institutions. Slavery in Egypt was real, it was cruel, and it was woven into the economy. It just did not build the pyramids. Ancient Greece. Ancient Greece produced democracy, philosophy, the foundations of Western mathematics, and one of the most comprehensively slave-dependent societies in human history, and it felt no contradiction between these things whatsoever. Athens at its democratic peak held an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 enslaved people out of a population of roughly 300,000, meaning 1 in every 3 people in the birthplace of democracy was someone else's property. Aristotle, in his Politics, argued that some human beings were slaves by nature, suited by intellectual inferiority for physical labor under their rational superiors. This was not a fringe position. It was the mainstream justification for a system the entire Athenian economy depended upon. The silver mines at Laurion employed tens of thousands in conditions contemporary sources described as hellish. Tunnels less than a meter high, 24-hour shifts by torchlight, chained workers who never saw sunlight, with a mortality rate that made the mines effectively a death sentence. The silver from those mines financed the navy that defeated Persia at Salamis in 480 BCE, meaning Greek freedom was purchased with enslaved labor in the most literal sense. Sparta operated a different and even more extreme system through the Helots, a conquered population kept in collective agricultural bondage to the state rather than to individual owners. Sparta institutionalized terror through the Crypteia, in which young Spartan men were sent into Helot territory at night, authorized to kill any Helot they encountered. When 20,000 enslaved people escaped Athens during the Peloponnesian War, as Thucydides records, it was one of the largest mass escapes in ancient history, and it revealed how fragile the system was beneath its philosophical confidence. Ancient Rome. Rome took Greek justifications for slavery, stripped away the philosophical nuance, and built the largest, most economically integrated slave system the ancient world had ever seen. By the late Republic, historians like Keith Hopkins estimate enslaved people constituted 30 to 40% of the Italian peninsula's population, potentially 2 to 3 million people. The engine was conquest. Every major campaign was also a slave market event. The destruction of Carthage in 146 BCE, the Judean Wars of 70 CE, Trajan's Dacian campaigns, each flooded the markets with new bodies. Roman slavery was remarkable for its functional diversity. Enslaved people worked as gladiators and as physicians, as agricultural laborers chained to the latifundia estates of Sicily, and as educated secretaries managing senators' correspondence. Some, particularly in the imperial bureaucracy, held informal power most free Romans could only dream of. Roman law made a slave legally a res, a thing with no standing in court, yet one who could hold a peculium, a personal fund, run businesses, and sometimes purchase freedom through manumission. Manumission was common enough that freed slaves formed a significant social class, though the stigma of servile origin lasted generations. The latifundia produced the conditions for 3 major slave revolts, culminating in the Third Servile War led by the Thracian gladiator Spartacus from 73 to 71 BCE, in which between 70,000 and 120,000 enslaved people took up arms against Rome. When the rebellion was crushed, Crassus crucified 6,000 survivors along the 130-mile Appian Way, one body every 100 feet from Capua to Rome, a message written in corpses that the system would not tolerate challenge. Ancient China, Qin, and Han dynasties. Chinese slavery under the Qin and Han looked fundamentally different from anything in the contemporary Mediterranean, and the difference reveals how much the structure of a state shapes the structure of its unfreedom. In Rome, private individuals owned enslaved people. In Qin and Han China, the state was the dominant slaveholder, and the primary mechanism feeding the system was not war or debt, but the criminal justice apparatus. The Qin legal code prescribed enslavement not just for the convicted criminal, but for their entire family. So a single conviction could transform a whole household into state property overnight. These government-owned enslaved people, called guanu, worked on imperial construction projects of staggering scale. The first emperor Qin Shi Huang mobilized hundreds of thousands of coerced laborers to build the Great Wall, the Apang Palace, and his burial complex at Xi'an, guarded by the terracotta army of 8,000 clay soldiers. These workers were not precisely chattel slaves, but they had no freedom of movement, no ability to refuse, and a mortality rate suggesting the distinction between coerced labor and work to death was largely semantic. Private slavery existed but was ideologically uncomfortable within Confucian thought, which idealized free farming households. This tension meant slavery never became as economically normalized in China as in the Mediterranean. The Han Emperor Wang Mang, who ruled from 9 to 23 CE, briefly abolished private slave sales as part of his reformist agenda, though his regime collapsed before the reform could take hold. What persisted instead was a legal underclass called the Jianmin, mean people, below free commoners and above chattel slaves, blurring the boundary between slavery and caste in ways that echoed through Chinese history for centuries. The Islamic world. Islamic slavery lasted longer, spread further, and moved more people than almost any other slave system in history, spanning from the 7th century CE to the early 20th and reaching from Iberia to Southeast Asia. It operated within a distinctive legal and theological framework. The Quran and Hadith permitted slavery, but placed specific obligations around it. Enslaved people had the right to purchase their freedom, owners were prohibited from separating nursing mothers from infants, and manumission was explicitly described as a pious act, creating a religious incentive for freeing enslaved people that had no parallel in Roman or American law. The primary sources were non-Muslim war captives and the trans-Saharan trade, which moved an estimated 10 to 18 million Africans northward across the Sahara over 12 centuries, according to Paul Lovejoy's research, a figure that rivals the transatlantic trade. One uniquely Islamic institution was the military slave, known as Ghulam or Mamluk, young men, frequently Turkic or Circassian, enslaved as children and trained from boyhood as elite soldiers who owed absolute loyalty to their commander-owner. This system produced rulers. The Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt, which governed from 1250 to 1517 CE and defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, was literally a state run by former military slaves. The Ottoman Devshirme system, which conscripted Christian boys from the Balkans, converted them and channeled them into the Janissary Corps, or administration, produced grand viziers who were technically still slaves of the Sultan while wielding near-total executive power. The sexual dimension was also institutionalized. Enslaved concubines populated elite households across the Islamic world, and children born of a free man and an enslaved concubine were considered free and legitimate heirs, giving enslaved women a pathway to elevated status through motherhood that had no equivalent in American chattel slavery. The Byzantine Empire. Byzantium inherited the full weight of Roman legal tradition around slavery and carried it forward for 1,000 years. When Western Europe was slowly transforming chattel slavery into serfdom, Constantinople was still running an active, commercially sophisticated slave market on the Bosphorus. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the legal codification ordered by Justinian and completed in 534 CE, preserved Roman slavery law in meticulous detail, including the conditions under which enslaved people could seek sanctuary in churches, a Christian addition to the Roman framework. The Byzantine Church's position was characteristically ambiguous. Theologians like John Chrysostom preached against the mistreatment of enslaved people and argued that all souls were equal before God, while accepting the institution itself as a natural feature of earthly society. The primary sources were military. Wars against Bulgars, Slavs, Arabs, and Turks generated a constant supply of captives. It is during this period, in the exchange between Byzantine markets, Venetian merchants, and Slavic raiding, that the word slave itself entered European languages. The ethnic name Slav became so synonymous with the enslaved condition in medieval Latin, appearing as sklavus, that it displaced older vocabulary and gave virtually every Western European language its word for a person held in bondage, a linguistic monument to the scale of Slavic suffering. Venetian and Genoese merchants operating through Byzantine ports were among the most active slave traders of the medieval Mediterranean, and Constantinople's position as a commercial hub meant the seat of Roman Christianity was also one of the busiest slave markets in the medieval world. Viking and Norse Scandinavia. The Norse word for an enslaved person was thrall, still alive in English today, embedded in enthralled, a linguistic trace of how completely the institution shaped Norse culture. Thraldom was economically central and socially normalized, and the Viking raids that terrorized coastal Europe from the late 8th century onward were as much slave procurement operations as plunder expeditions. Dublin, established by Norse settlers in the 9th century, functioned as one of medieval Europe's largest slave markets, with Irish captives processed, held, and sold to buyers from across the Viking world. The legal status of a thrall under Norse law, as recorded in the Grogos and other Icelandic codes, was about as absolute as slavery gets. A thrall had no legal standing, could be killed by their owner, with only a minor fine payable to the king, and their testimony was worthless. The Arab traveler Ibn Fadlan, who witnessed a Rus chieftain's funeral on the Volga in 922 CE, recorded in graphic detail the ritual killing of a slave woman who had volunteered, or been coerced into volunteering, to die with her master. Norse mythology naturalized this hierarchy by claiming that thralls, carls, free farmers, and jarls, nobles, each descended from separate ancestral figures, making the social order divinely ordained. The economic logic of Norse expansion into Russia, down the Volga and toward Constantinople, was substantially a slave trading logic. Varangian Vikings captured Slavic people in the forested interior of Eastern Europe and sold them in Byzantine and Islamic markets, turning human beings into the trade goods that financed Norse commercial expansion. Medieval Europe, serfdom, and slavery. Medieval Western Europe presents one of history's most instructive institutional transformations. Roman chattel slavery did not disappear after the empire's fall. It mutated, blending with and gradually being replaced by serfdom, a system where people were bound not to an owner as personal property, but to the land itself. The legal distinction had enormous practical consequences, even when the lived experience was nearly indistinguishable. A serf could not be sold away from the land, could not leave without their lord's permission, could not marry without approval, owed unpaid labor, corvée, several days per week, and had no meaningful recourse against noble authority. The Catholic Church's role was characteristically contradictory. It discouraged the enslavement of fellow baptized Christians, which reduced chattel slavery of European-born people, while blessing the enslavement of pagans and Muslims, which redirected the trade outward. Venice and Genoa remained active slave traders throughout the medieval period, importing enslaved Tatars, Circassians, and Slavic people from Black Sea markets well into the 15th century. The Black Death, which arrived in 1347 and killed roughly a third of the continent within a few years, disrupted serfdom more effectively than any peasant uprising. The catastrophic labor shortage gave surviving workers leverage they had never possessed, and many began demanding payment, better conditions, or the right to move. The English Statute of Labourers of 1351 attempted to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and bind workers to their employers, a panicked aristocratic effort to maintain control when the demographics had shifted. It failed in the long run. By the late 15th century, Western European elites were looking across the Atlantic for a solution to their labor needs. The Aztec Empire. Aztec slavery, known in Nahuatl as Tlacotin, was so structurally different from the systems European conquistadors knew that when Cortes and his men encountered it in 1519, they struggled to categorize it because it violated nearly every assumption European slavery was built on. Children born to enslaved parents were born free. Enslaved people could own property, conduct business, and in some documented cases owned enslaved people themselves. The roots into slavery were not war and racial designation, but voluntary self-sale to escape poverty, or unpayable debt, criminal conviction for offenses like repeated theft or treason, and failure to honor contracts. The Great Market at Tlatelolco, which Bernal Diaz del Castillo described as surpassing anything he had seen in Spain, included a dedicated section for the sale of enslaved people. Aztec law built escape mechanisms directly into the institution. An enslaved person who ran away and reached a royal palace could claim sanctuary and be freed. And during specific ceremonial slave markets, one who escaped into the crowd and reached the king's presence before being recaptured was freed on the spot, with their owner forbidden by law from pursuing them. The most troubling role of enslaved people, from the perspective of later observers, was as sacrificial victims in religious ceremonies. Owners who mistreated enslaved people excessively could have them legally transferred to new owners, a provision with no equivalent in the American South. Spanish conquest replaced this system with something incomparably more brutal and racially absolute, erasing the Aztec framework entirely. West African kingdoms. West African slavery before and during European contact is one of the most politically charged topics in this survey, partly because it has been weaponized by apologists for the Atlantic trade seeking to distribute moral responsibility, and partly because the reality is genuinely complicated. Slavery existed throughout West African societies before Portuguese ships appeared in the mid-15th century, but the institution was structurally different from what the Atlantic trade would create. In the Mali Empire under Mansa Musa, in the Songhai Empire centered on Gao and Timbuktu, and in smaller states across the Sahel and forest zones, enslaved people were integrated into households with a degree of absorption that distinguished the system from chattel models. Descendants of enslaved people frequently became full community members within a generation or two, and enslaved people could hold administrative authority and military command. The trans-Saharan trade had been active for centuries before Atlantic contact, and some West African rulers were already embedded in this commerce as suppliers. So the economic logic of selling captured enemies was not alien. What the Portuguese introduced beginning around 1441 and what the Atlantic plantation economy rapidly amplified was a demand so enormous and so racially absolute that it transformed the internal political economy of the entire region. Captives became the primary export commodity, and states like Dahomey and Asante restructured their entire military and political apparatus around slave raiding to meet Atlantic demand. The Oyo Empire's relationship with the trade was more ambivalent, oscillating between supplier and target. The result was a 400-year intensification of warfare, raiding, and political instability across West Africa that served European plantation economies at catastrophic cost to West African societies themselves. The Inca Empire. The Inca Empire raises a productive question. Was it even a slave society in any meaningful sense? The answer reveals how much the concept depends on private property, markets, and money, none of which the Inca state had in conventional form. The Mita system, the backbone of Inca labor extraction, required all adult male subjects to contribute a portion of their labor annually to the state in exchange for food, clothing, coca, and chicha beer during their service. This was not chattel slavery, but it was not free labor either. The obligation was compulsory, enforced by the full power of a highly organized state. The Chapak Nyan, the royal road network stretching approximately 40,000 kilometers through some of the most extreme terrain on Earth, including Andean passes above 4,000 meters, was built and maintained entirely through Mita labor. Within this system existed a more precisely enslaved category called the Yana, people permanently detached from their home communities and assigned to perpetual personal service to the nobility or the state, stripped of community identity. Yana status could be conferred as an honor or imposed as a punishment, and over time the Yana became a permanent hereditary class, spanning skilled weavers and potters to agricultural laborers on royal estates. The Aisla system operated parallel. Selected women, sometimes called chosen women or virgins of the sun, were taken from communities across the empire as girls, housed in state facilities called Uxla Huasi, and set to producing fine textiles and sacred chicha, a form of gender-specific coerced labor with no exit. When the Spanish arrived and adapted the Almeida for the silver mines of Potosi, they took the Inca labor obligation, stripped away its reciprocal provisions entirely, and turned it into a death machine. The Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire ran one of history's most institutionally complex slave systems for over 600 years, and its most distinctive feature was that enslaved people sat at the very apex of its military and governmental power while being the property of the Sultan. The Devshirme system, the gathering. Conscripted Christian boys aged roughly 8 to 18 from Balkan and Anatolian communities, converting them to Islam, educating the most promising in palace schools, and channeling them into the Janissary infantry or the Imperial Civil Service. These men were technically cool, slaves of the Sultan, yet the Grand Viziers who ran the empire's daily administration under Suleiman the Magnificent were almost exclusively Devshirme graduates. The harem of Topkapi Palace, which at its height housed hundreds of women, was organized as a formal institution with its own hierarchy and political economy. Enslaved women, predominantly Circassian and Georgian, entered as property and could rise through influence and royal favor to become Haseki, the Sultan's favorite, and eventually valid Sultan, Queen Mother, the most powerful woman in the empire. The Sultanate of Women in the 16th and early 17th centuries, during which queen mothers like Kosum Sultan exercised effective political control during the minorities of their sons, was built on the careers of formerly enslaved women. Meanwhile, the empire's external slave supply was sustained by the Barbary corsairs of North Africa, who raided Mediterranean coastlines and reached as far as the British Isles. The historian Robert Davis estimates that between 1530 and 1780, roughly 1 million to 1.25 million Europeans were captured into North African slavery, a figure that remains debated but speaks to the system's reach. Colonial Spanish America. Spanish colonialism in the Americas deployed not a single slave system, but an overlapping architecture of coercive labor institutions that varied by region and period, and together they constituted one of history's most lethal experiments in extraction. The encomienda granted a Spanish colonist the labor and tribute of a specified indigenous community in exchange for the theoretical obligation to provide Christian instruction and protection, a legal fiction that in practice meant indigenous people worked for Spanish benefit under conditions of violence and terror. The Requerimiento of 1513 was perhaps the most cynically absurd legal document in colonial history. A text read aloud in Spanish to indigenous populations who did not understand the language, informing them they must immediately submit to the Spanish crown and the Catholic Church, or face war and enslavement, a process that legitimized conquest, regardless of whether anyone understood it. Dominican friar Bartolomé de las Casas witnessed the destruction of indigenous Caribbean populations and documented it in his A Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies, 1542, becoming the first systematic European critic of colonial slavery and arguing that millions had died from overwork, violence, and disease. The Potosi silver mine became the most lethal single-force labor site in the Western Hemisphere. Operating under the Metis system, it drew indigenous workers from up to 1,000 miles away for 4-month shifts at altitudes above 4,000 meters, processing silver with mercury that poisoned the lungs and destroyed the nervous system, producing a death toll historians estimated between 4 and 8 million people over the mine's operational history, though that figure remains contested. African enslaved people began arriving in Spanish colonies around 1501, and as indigenous populations collapsed, the demand for African labor intensified, drawing the Spanish colonies into the Atlantic slave trade at massive scale. The Atlantic slave trade and plantation Americas. The Atlantic slave trade was the largest forced migration in human history. According to the Transatlantic Slave Trade Database at slavevoyages.org, the most comprehensive scholarly compilation of voyage records ever assembled, approximately 12.5 million Africans were loaded onto slave ships between roughly 1500 and 1866, of whom an estimated 10.7 million survived the Middle Passage to reach the Americas. The roughly 1.8 million who died at sea perished in conditions that were, by design and economics, as dense and degrading as maritime engineering allowed. The Brooks slave ship diagram, published by British abolitionists in 1788, showed human bodies packed shoulder to shoulder across every inch of the hold, and it became one of history's most effective pieces of visual advocacy, precisely because it rendered the abstract in the concrete. Mortality on the Middle Passage averaged 12 to 15% in the 17th century, and declined to roughly 5% by the late 18th, not out of humanitarian concern, but because captains and investors calculated that healthier cargo produced better returns. The plantation system was the economic engine driving the entire Atlantic world. Caribbean sugar, Brazilian coffee and sugar, Chesapeake tobacco, and Deep South cotton were produced by enslaved hands and generated the capital that financed European banking, built the port cities of Liverpool, Bristol, and Bordeaux, and according to historian Eric Williams's influential, if debated, thesis, helped capitalize the Industrial Revolution itself. American chattel slavery distinguished itself by making bondage hereditary through the female line, codified in Virginia law in 1662 under the principle of partus sequitur ventrum. The child follows the condition of the mother, ensuring that the offspring of enslaved women could never be born free. Brazil received the largest share of the trade, approximately 4.9 million Africans, and was the last country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888, the American South. American slavery deserves its own account because its specific racial, legal, and cultural architecture was constructed with unusual deliberateness and produced consequences that remain structurally present. The first Africans arrived in English North America at Point Comfort, Virginia in August 1619, aboard a ship that had taken them from a Portuguese slaver, and their initial legal status was genuinely ambiguous. Some appear to have been treated as indentured servants who could eventually earn freedom. That ambiguity was closed by a series of Virginia statutes between the 1660s and 1705 that explicitly defined Africans and their descendants as hereditary chattel property, making race the legal marker of permanent enslavement in a way that had no precise precedent in the ancient world. The 3/5 compromise in the U.S. Constitution of 1787, which counted enslaved people as 3/5 of a person for congressional apportionment while denying them any rights whatsoever, gave slaveholding states outsized federal representation for 80 years, and was a primary political driver of the sectional conflict that produced the Civil War. After the international slave trade was banned in 1808, the domestic trade intensified to supply Deep South demand. Historian Walter Johnson, in Soul by Soul, estimates that approximately 1 million enslaved people were sold from the Upper South to the Deep South between 1808 and 1865, a forced migration that systematically destroyed families and that enslaved people experienced as one of the most feared catastrophes of their lives. The patrol system, which required white men to police roads and catch escapees, is widely recognized as a direct institutional ancestor of American policing. The 13th Amendment, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime, a clause almost immediately exploited through convict leasing, by which states leased primarily black convicts to private companies for forced labor, persisting well into the 20th century. Imperial Russia and serfdom. Russian serfdom, as it existed between the Law Code of 1649 and its abolition in 1861, was, in the judgment of most historians who study it comparatively, slavery in every meaningful practical sense, even if Russian law drew a technical distinction. By the 18th century, Russian nobles had accumulated nearly unlimited power over serfs. They could exile them to Siberia, have them flogged publicly, conscript them into the army for 25-year terms, and most revealingly, sell them as individuals completely separate from the land, meaning they were being sold as persons, not as agricultural attachments, a definition that satisfies virtually any serious criterion for chattel slavery. Catherine the Great, who corresponded with Enlightenment philosophers about liberty and reason, simultaneously issued edicts that expanded noble power over serfs to its greatest historical extent, prohibiting serfs from petitioning the throne against their masters under penalty of exile. At the system's peak in the early 19th century, between 34 and 40% of Russia's population were serfs, tens of millions of people, making this one of the largest concentrations of unfree labor in history. The Pugachev Rebellion of 1773 to 1775, led by the Cossack Yemelyan Pugachev, who promised freedom and land to serfs who joined him, engulfed an enormous swath of the Volga region before being crushed by imperial military force. Russian literature became a vehicle for abolitionist argument. Alexander Radishchev's A Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, 1790, described the condition of serfs, with enough moral clarity that Catherine had him arrested and sentenced to death, later commuted to Siberian exile. Tsar Alexander II abolished serfdom in 1861, 2 years before Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, but the terms required former serfs to pay redemption payments to the state for the land they received, payments not cancelled until 1907, keeping millions in effective economic bondage long after legal freedom was declared. Colonial Africa and the Scramble. European colonialism across Africa in the late 19th and early 20th centuries produced forced labor systems that operated under the legal vocabulary of civilization and administration rather than slavery, but the experience of those subjected to them, in the mines, on the rubber plantations, on the railway construction gangs, was frequently indistinguishable from any prior definition of enslaved labor. The Congo Free State, the personal colonial possession of King Leopold II of Belgium from 1885 to 1908, is the most thoroughly documented case. The Force Publique, Leopold's private army, enforced rubber quotas by requiring soldiers to produce severed human hands as proof that their bullets had been used to compel production rather than wasted, leading to a grotesque market in hands taken from living people. The historian Adam Hochschild in King Leopold's Ghost of 1998 synthesized the evidence for a death toll from violence, famine, and disease of approximately 10 million Congolese, a figure debated by some scholars but supported by dramatic census comparisons. In German Southwest Africa, the colonial response to the Herero Uprising of 1904 produced what historians now widely recognize as the 20th century's first genocide. After military defeat, Herero and Nama populations were driven into the Omaheke Desert, and survivors placed in concentration camps where death rates exceeded 50%. Across British East and Southern Africa, hut and poll taxes, levied in cash that subsistence farmers could not obtain without wage employment, functioned as economic coercion that forced men into mine and farm labor involuntarily. South African apartheid, formalized from 1948, extended and systematized racial labor coercion through pass laws, job reservation, and the Bantustan homeland system for another 4 decades. Modern and contemporary slavery. The word slavery in the contemporary world refers to a cluster of legally prohibited but persistently practiced conditions, and the International Labor Organization estimates that approximately 40 million people are living within some form of it right now, making this not a concluded chapter of history, but an ongoing global emergency. North Korea operates what the United Nations Commission of Inquiry, reporting in 2014, described as a comprehensive state-run forced labor system. The Kwan Lee So political prison camp network holds an estimated 80,000 to 120,000 people in conditions survivors describe as including systematic starvation, forced labor, torture, and summary execution, while the government separately exports workers abroad under agreements in which wages are paid directly to the state rather than to the workers. The kafala sponsorship system governing migrant workers in Gulf states ties workers legally to individual employers who control their immigration status, making it illegal to change jobs or leave the country without employer permission, a structural dependency that Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have compared to debt bondage. The construction program for Qatar's 2022 FIFA World Cup brought this to international attention. A widely cited figure of 6,500 migrant worker deaths appears in The Guardian's reporting but is contested, since the figure encompasses all causes of death across all nationalities over a decade, making direct causal attribution a matter of ongoing dispute. Forced labor is embedded in global supply chains. Cobalt mining in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where children work in artisanal mines feeding battery production for smartphones and electric vehicles. Fishing vessels in Southeast Asian waters, where workers cannot leave the boat. And brick kilns across South Asia running on debt bondage that traps workers across generations. The Xinjiang detention and forced labor system in China, where the U.S. government and numerous human rights organizations report that between 1 and 1.8 million Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities have been held since approximately 2017, is described by Beijing as voluntary vocational training, a characterization rejected by survivors and the preponderance of independent researchers. The legal architecture against modern slavery, including the UN's 1956 Supplementary Convention and the Palermo Protocol of 2000, exists. The gap between that law and the reality of 40 million people is the measure of how much work remains. Ancient Mesopotamia, the earliest civilization to leave written records, also left the earliest written evidence of madness, and their explanation was simple: you had angered a god. In ancient Mesopotamia, roughly between 3000 and 500 BCE, mental illness was not a condition of the brain or the blood. It was a spiritual verdict. The Babylonians and Assyrians believed that disordered behavior, uncontrollable weeping, irrational speech, violent outbursts, withdrawal from the world, were the visible consequences of divine punishment or demonic possession, often triggered by breaking a sacred oath or failing in a religious duty. The primary response was not medical, but priestly. A specialist called the Ashipu would be summoned to diagnose the spiritual cause of the affliction through ritual examination, then perform elaborate exorcism ceremonies involving chanted incantation, herbal preparations, and animal sacrifice, all designed to appease the offended deity or drive out the invading demon. A second type of healer, the Asus, worked more with physical remedies, plant-based medicines, poultices, and dietary interventions, but even these were wrapped in spiritual framing because the boundary between body and spirit simply did not exist as a concept. There were no institutions, no asylums, no hospitals. The mentally ill remained with their families, which meant that the quality of your care depended entirely on the wealth, patience, and devotion of your household. What makes Mesopotamia genuinely remarkable, though, is that their physicians were also careful observers. The Sakiku, a massive diagnostic handbook compiled around 1067 BCE by the scholar Esagil Opli, lists symptoms across dozens of conditions in systematic detail, and buried within its clay tablets are descriptions of what we would today recognize as depression, mania, and epilepsy, each attributed to a specific god or demon. Yes, but described with a clinical precision that is striking across 3,000 years of distance. Ancient Egypt. The Egyptians approached the problem of madness from two directions simultaneously, and never seemed particularly troubled by the contradiction. On one hand, mental disturbance could be a physical ailment, a disorder of the heart which Egyptians believed to be the seat of thought and emotion, not merely a pump for blood. On the other hand, it could be the work of an angry deity or a restless spirit of the dead, and both explanations could apply to the same patient on the same day. What is most remarkable about Egypt is what they did not do. They did not systematically exile, imprison, or execute those whose minds had broken. The mentally ill largely remained within family and community structures, cared for by relatives with the support of local healers who combined medicine and magic without distinguishing between them. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BCE and one of the oldest medical documents ever recovered, records treatments for conditions resembling depression and anxiety. Herbal remedies administered alongside the recitation of spells, because the spell and the medicine were both parts of the same cure. Temples served as healing centers where the sick, including those with mental disturbances, would sleep in sacred precincts and wait for diagnostic dreams that temple priests would then interpret. The sounds of music and the scent of Kyphi incense were deliberately used to calm disturbed patients, making Egypt one of the earliest recorded civilizations to employ something resembling sensory therapy. They also documented hysteria in women, attributing episodes of irrational behavior or physical convulsions to a wandering uterus, a diagnosis so durable it would survive, embarrassingly, well into the 19th century of the Common Era in European medicine. Ancient Greece. Greece is where the story of mental illness takes its first sharp turn away from the divine and toward the physical, or at least where the argument for doing so begins in earnest. Hippocrates, working in the 5th century BCE, made a radical claim. Madness was not the work of gods. It was a malfunction of the body. His model pointed to an imbalance among 4 bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, with an excess of black bile specifically producing the condition he called melancholia. In his text on the sacred disease, he took direct aim at epilepsy, then widely considered a divine affliction, and argued it was simply a brain disorder disorder like any other. This was a genuinely courageous intellectual position in a culture where the gods were not metaphors. And yet, popular belief moved nowhere near as fast as Hippocrates. The Greeks simultaneously held that Dionysus could strike a person mad as punishment, that the Furies could drive a man to murderous insanity, and that being touched by divine madness was in certain poetic frameworks a form of inspiration rather than illness. Treatment accordingly split along class and circumstance. The wealthy consulted physicians who prescribed exercise, regulated diet, warm baths, and structured rest. The religiously inclined made pilgrimages to temples of Asclepius, the god of medicine, where they would sleep on the temple floor and wait for healing dreams, a practice called incubation. The poor, the homeless, and the severely disturbed had no such option. They wandered public spaces where they might be mocked, ignored, or occasionally driven out of the city entirely. Aristotle complicated the picture further by suggesting in Problemata, a text of disputed authorship, that melancholic temperaments were disproportionately common among great philosophers, poets, and statesmen, planting an idea that would bloom into the romantic myth of the mad genius and never fully die, ancient Rome. Rome absorbed Greek medicine wholesale and then added something distinctly Roman to the equation: bureaucracy. For the first time in recorded history, madness became a legal category as well as a medical one. Roman law designated severely mentally disturbed individuals as furiosus, the furious, a classification that stripped them of legal personhood and transferred control over their affairs to family-appointed guardians called curatores. Your sanity, in Rome, was a legal status that could be revoked, and its revocation had immediate practical consequences for your property, your contracts, and your freedom. Wealthy Romans who lost their minds had access to Galen's medicine, the Greek-trained physician who dominated Roman medical thought from the 2nd century CE onward, and who made the crucial anatomical argument that mental functions resided in the brain, not the heart. Galen prescribed baths, dietary regimens, music, and what he called occupational activities, keeping the hands and mind engaged with tasks to prevent the downward spiral of idleness and melancholy. The Roman bath complex, those vast steaming marble halls that served as social centers, functioned as something like a public mental health infrastructure, not by design, but by effect. For the poor, none of this was available. A dangerous or disordered individual without family resources could be chained in a cellar, confined with criminals in a city jail, or simply abandoned to the streets. The gladiatorial games operated in the background of all of this. An empire that consumed mass violence as public entertainment had a complicated relationship with the concept of sanity, and the line between performed brutality and genuine madness was, in the arena at least, deliberately blurred. Ancient China. Chinese civilization developed its understanding of mental illness independently of the Greek and Mesopotamian traditions, arriving at a framework that was equally sophisticated and considerably more integrated into everyday medical practice. Traditional Chinese medicine understood the mind and body as a single continuous system governed by the flow of qi, vital energy, and organized around the balance of yin and yang. Mental disturbance was not divine punishment. It was a disruption of this energetic balance, often connected to specific organs. The heart governed joy, the liver governed anger, the kidneys governed fear, the lungs governed grief, and the spleen governed worry. So a person consumed by irrational terror had a kidney problem, and someone trapped in inexplicable grief had a lung problem. The Huangdi Neijing, the Yellow Emperor's classic of medicine, compiled between roughly the 2nd century BCE and the 3rd century CE, contains detailed descriptions of conditions resembling mania, depression, and what we might now call psychotic breaks, framed within this 5-organ system. Treatment was acupuncture, herbal formulas, dietary adjustment, and the restoration of energetic flow, none of which involved restraint or isolation as a first response. Confucian social values reinforced this. Family was the fundamental unit of society, and caring for a disturbed relative was a moral obligation that could not be delegated or abandoned without profound shame. Institutionalization did not exist as a concept for most of Chinese history. Severely violent individuals might be physically restrained within the household, or in extreme cases referred to local magistrates as a public safety matter, but the default was always family containment. The result was a system that was, by the standards of most other civilizations, far more humane, not out of advanced medical thinking alone, but because the social structure made abandonment culturally unacceptable. Islamic Golden Age. Between roughly 750 and 1258 CE, while most of Europe was managing mental illness through exorcism and prayer, the physicians of the Islamic world were building dedicated hospitals, journals, writing systematic psychiatric textbooks, and developing treatment philosophies that would not be matched in the West for another 500 years. The theological foundation mattered enormously. Islamic scholars determined that the mentally ill were not morally culpable for their condition. They were sick, not sinful. This single doctrinal position had practical consequences that rippled through every aspect of care. Al-Razi, known in the West as Reza, directed the Baghdad hospital in the 9th century and wrote extensively on psychological distress, insisting on direct clinical conversation with patients as a diagnostic tool, rather than relying entirely on observation from a distance. Ibn Sina, whose Canon of Medicine remained a standard medical text in European universities until the 17th century, described conditions resembling depression, mania, and delusional thinking, with careful precision and recommended structured environments, music, social interaction, and herbal medicines. The Bimaristan, the Islamic hospital, represented the world's first dedicated psychiatric care facilities. The Bimaristan in Baghdad and the Cairo Bimaristan of Al-Mansur, founded in 1284 CE, were described by contemporary travelers as places of remarkable order and gentleness. Patients were housed in clean wards, provided with regular food, exposed to flowing water and gardens deliberately designed for calming effect, and treated by salaried physicians. Nothing comparable existed anywhere else in the medieval world. The contrast with what was happening simultaneously in Europe is not subtle. Medieval Europe. In medieval Europe, roughly 500 to 1400 CE, the dominant framework for understanding madness was theological, and it produced responses that ranged from neglectful to catastrophic. Mental illness was most commonly understood as divine punishment for sin, evidence of demonic possession, or in rare and carefully managed cases, a form of holy suffering that might mark the afflicted as spiritually significant. The practical consequence of this framework was that the primary treatment infrastructure was the church, which was to say exorcism, prayer, pilgrimage to the shrines of healing saints, and the wearing of blessed amulets. Some monasteries provided shelter and basic care for disturbed individuals, but this was geographically inconsistent and entirely dependent on the goodwill of individual religious communities. Those whose behavior was merely strange were largely left to wander. Those who became dangerous were locked in town jails alongside criminals, because the jail was the only building with locks. Bethlehem Royal Hospital in London, founded in 1247 and admitting mentally ill patients by the late 14th century, became the most famous institution of its kind in the English-speaking world, eventually giving the language the word bedlam as a synonym for chaos and disorder. Conditions there were so notoriously grim that by the 17th century, paying visitors could tour the wards as entertainment. At the village level, a parallel system of folk remedies operated beneath official church doctrine. Herbalists, wise women, and local healers prescribed plants, charms, and rituals involving holy water, blending Christian practice with pre-Christian tradition in ways the church officially condemned and practically tolerated. The Renaissance in early modern Europe. The Renaissance produced one of history's more uncomfortable contradictions. The same intellectual movement that began questioning supernatural explanations for madness also presided over the most intense persecution of the mentally disordered that Europe had ever seen. The witch trials of the 15th through 17th centuries consumed enormous numbers of people exhibiting what would today be recognized as psychosis, mania, or severe depression. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1486, and essentially a manual for identifying and prosecuting witches, described behaviors indistinguishable from psychotic episodes and prescribed torture and execution as their remedy. Thousands died. Simultaneously, Spain was pioneering a different approach. The Hospital dels Innocents in Valencia, founded in 1410, is among the earliest institutions in Europe specifically dedicated to the care, not merely the confinement, of the mentally ill. The Ship of Fools, the image of boats transporting the mad from town to town, whether literally practiced or primarily a cultural metaphor, captures the dominant social impulse of the era perfectly. Remove the disordered from view, push them elsewhere, make them someone else's problem. Paracelsus proposed chemical and astrological causes for madness, which replaced one unverifiable framework with another, but the physical restraint of patients, chains, manacles, iron confinement cages, became increasingly standardized in the emerging asylum system, establishing a logic of containment that would dominate European psychiatry for the next 4 centuries. Colonial America. Early colonial America had no system for dealing with mental illness, because it had no system for much of anything beyond immediate survival. The mentally ill were a family problem first and a community problem second. Those without families were warned out, officially instructed to leave town, or auctioned off to local households willing to board them at public expense. a practice that treated disturbed human beings with approximately the same administrative logic as stray livestock. Puritan theology in New England remained a powerful interpretive lens. Inexplicable behavior invited suspicion of demonic influence, and the Salem witch trials of 1692 represent the lethal endpoint of that suspicion, with several accusers, and possibly some of the accused exhibiting symptoms that later historians have connected to mass hysteria or individual psychotic episodes, though this interpretation remains actively debated among scholars. As colonial populations grew, jails and almshouses absorbed the mentally ill by default, not by policy design, but because confinement was the only infrastructure available when a person became dangerous or destitute. Pennsylvania Hospital, founded in Philadelphia in 1751 with Benjamin Franklin among its advocates, became the first institution in the colonies to formally admit and attempt to treat mentally ill patients. The basement cells where those patients were housed were unheated, unlighted, and not meaningfully distinguishable from a dungeon, but the intention of treatment rather than mere punishment marked it as a step forward by the standards of its time. 18th to 19th century Europe, the Reform era. The Enlightenment forced a reckoning with a question previous centuries had not seriously asked. If reason is the highest human capacity, what do we owe to those who have lost it? The answer, gradually and unevenly, was medicine. Philippe Pinel, working in Paris during the Revolutionary period, became the symbolic founder of humane psychiatry when he ordered the removal of chains from patients at the Bicêtre Hospital in 1793 or 1797, depending on the source, a gesture that reframed the mentally ill as patients deserving treatment, rather than animals requiring restraint. In England, Quaker businessman William Tuke founded the York Retreat in 1786, a small residential community built on the radical premise that kindness, routine, meaningful work, and basic dignity could restore reason where chains had failed. Moral treatment, as this philosophy came to be called, achieved genuine early results. Discharge rates at well-run small retreats were high enough to astonish contemporary observers. The fatal flaw was scale. As the 19th century progressed, asylum populations exploded across Europe and North America, driven by urbanization, poverty, and an expanding definition of what constituted dangerous madness. Institutions designed for dozens housed hundreds, then thousands. Moral treatment required small patient-to-staff ratios, genuine relationships, and consistent care, none of which survived the transition to industrial-scale warehousing. Psychiatry simultaneously professionalized, creating a class of alienists and asylum superintendents whose authority over their patients was nearly absolute, essentially unaccountable, and backed by law. Victorian-era asylum. The Victorian asylum was an empire unto itself, vast red brick institutions rising out of the English countryside, housing 1,000 patients or more behind high walls, run by superintendents who held near total power over every aspect of their patients' lives. Colney Hatch, lunatic asylum, opened in 1851, was at its founding the largest asylum in Europe. The treatments practiced in these institutions would be recognizable as torture by any modern standard. Hydrotherapy meant being strapped into a bath for hours or days at a time, sometimes in freezing water, sometimes scalding. Rotational chairs spun patients until they vomited, on the theory that the disorientation might shock the mind back into order. Surgical removal of teeth and sections of intestine was performed based on focal infection theory, which held that madness was caused by bacterial toxins from infected organs, a hypothesis with essentially no evidence behind it. Women suffered disproportionately. Hysteria served as a catch-all diagnosis for any behavior deemed unfeminine, inconvenient, or simply inconvenient to a husband, and women could be committed with minimal legal protection on the word of a male relative. The rest cure developed by American physician Silas Weir Mitchell in 1873, complete bed rest, isolation, enforced inactivity, and a fattening diet, was prescribed almost exclusively to women and drove at least one patient, the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman, to the edge of a permanent breakdown, which she later documented in devastating detail. Lunacy reform movements in Britain produced inspection regimes and oversight committees, but the scale of the system and the near total dependency of patients on their keepers made meaningful accountability nearly impossible. Modern era. The 20th century opened with the asylum at its institutional peak and closed with most of those buildings empty, repurposed, or demolished. The transformation came from two directions at once. Chlorpromazine, introduced in France in 1952 and approved in the United States in 1954, was the first antipsychotic medication that genuinely reduced the symptoms of psychosis in a reproducible way, and its arrival gave governments a pharmacological justification for what they wanted to do anyway: close the expensive, politically embarrassing asylums and return their inhabitants to the community. Deinstitutionalization swept the Western world through the 1960s 1960s and 1970s, accelerated in the United States by the Community Mental Health Act of 1963. The theory was sound. Community-based care, outpatient clinics, and medication management could replace institutional confinement. The practice was a catastrophe of underfunding. The community support structures were never built at the necessary scale, and hundreds of thousands of people with serious mental illness were discharged into a world that had no place for them. Today, jails and prisons in the United States hold more people with serious mental illness than any psychiatric hospital, a grim structural echo of the medieval period, when the jail was simply where you put people who didn't fit anywhere else. Globally, the picture is more varied and often darker. In many parts of the world, chaining mentally ill individuals to beds or trees, in faith healing centers, performing exorcisms, and enforcing complete family isolation remain primary responses to severe mental illness in the 21st century. The history of how civilization has treated the insane is, in the end, a history of what any given society believed a broken mind deserved, and the answer has almost never been enough. Ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt is one of the earliest civilizations we have records of using systematic, state-sanctioned torture, and the methods were far less exotic than what came later, but no less brutal for it. The most common punishment was beating with rods, applied to the back and the soles of the feet in a style that would echo through centuries of human cruelty all the way to medieval Europe. Egyptian courts used physical punishment primarily to enforce confessions and as sentences for crimes, with the number of strokes sometimes reaching into the dozens or even higher, according to records preserved in surviving papyri. For more serious offenses, particularly theft and desertion, mutilation served as a permanent public marker. Nose removal, ear removal, or both, leaving the condemned visibly branded for the rest of their life. But perhaps the most quietly horrifying form of Egyptian torture wasn't theatrical at all. Condemned prisoners, slaves, and criminals sentenced to the gold mines of Nubia faced a slow death by exhaustion and dehydration in tunnels of crushing heat, with no rest permitted and guards positioned to prevent escape. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing centuries later, described the conditions in those mines with visible horror, noting that workers were chained and worked until they died where they stood. No screaming, no crowd, just the dark and the heat and the end of a person. Ancient Mesopotamia, and the Assyrian Empire in particular, didn't just practice torture, it advertised it. The Assyrian kings of the 9th through 7th centuries BCE left behind enormous stone palace reliefs at sites like Nineveh that explicitly depicted prisoners being flayed alive, impaled on stakes, and beheaded in rows. And these were not confessions of atrocity, but deliberate propaganda, monuments to power meant to be seen and feared. Flaying, the removal of skin from a living person, was performed on captured enemy commanders, and their skins were then stretched across city walls or draped over pillars as a message to anyone considering resistance. Impalement was applied at scale after military victories, with rows of impaled bodies arranged along roads leading to conquered cities, so that approaching populations understood what awaited defiance. Blinding, tongue removal, and hand amputation functioned as judicial punishments for specific crimes, calibrated to fit the offense in a grim early version of proportional justice. What makes Assyrian torture historically distinctive is that it was ritualized and institutional rather than chaotic. There was a system, a visual language of suffering designed to project imperial authority across an entire region through sheer terror. Ancient Persia. Ancient Persia is where we find one of the most disturbing execution methods in all of recorded history, and for once the historical account is specific enough to be genuinely hard to read. Scaphism, described by Plutarch in his Life of Artaxerxes, involved placing a condemned person inside 2 fitted boats with holes cut for the head, hands, and feet, then force-feeding them massive quantities of milk and honey until severe diarrhea set in, then coating every exposed surface of their body with the same mixture. The boat was then floated on a stagnant pond. The filth accumulated inside. Insects arrived. They fed, laid eggs, and bred in the flesh, while the victim was kept alive through continued force-feeding. Plutarch's account of one victim, a man named Mithridates, claims he survived 17 days before dying. Historians rightly note that scaphism is attested only in Greek sources describing Persian enemies, and some scholars question whether it was a widespread practice or an extreme rarity used for maximum political effect, but the single documented case is enough. The Persians also used crucifixion centuries before Rome adopted it, blinding as a political tool against rival claimants to the throne, and crushing under stone slabs for certain offenses. What unified these methods was the same logic that drove the Assyrians, suffering as a demonstration of sovereign power. Ancient Greece. Ancient Greece presents one of history's more uncomfortable contradictions. The civilization that produced Socrates, Plato, and the early architecture of democratic thought also institutionalized torture as a formal legal mechanism, and the reasoning was philosophical. Under Athenian law, the testimony of slaves was only considered legally valid if it was extracted under torture, a practice called basanos, because the assumption was that slaves would lie unless forced to tell the truth by pain. The word basanos itself originally referred to a touchstone used to test the purity of gold. Truth under duress was considered similarly tested and therefore reliable. Methods included the rack, the wheel, and whipping, all applied in legal settings with the apparent consent of the court system. Crucially, this applied only to slaves. Free citizens were legally protected from physical torture in judicial proceedings, creating a clear two-tier system where the most vulnerable people were simultaneously the most legally useful and the most legally disposable. The philosopher Aristotle actually raised early doubts about whether tortured testimony was reliable, noting that people under sufficient pain will say whatever stops the pain regardless of truth, a critique that took another 2,000 years to become legal consensus. Ancient Rome. Ancient Rome inherited Greek attitudes and expanded them significantly. Early Roman law similarly protected citizens from judicial torture while permitting it freely against slaves. But as the empire grew and class distinctions in the legal system became more formalized, this protection eroded. By the 3rd century CE, the distinction had shifted. Upper-class citizens, the honestiores, retained significant protections, while lower-class citizens, the humiliores, could be subjected to methods previously reserved for slaves. The Roman state employed professional torturers called quaestionari, whose job was specifically to extract confessions, and their tools included the rack, fire, and various forms of suspension. For public punishment and execution, Rome developed the damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to wild animals in the arena, which was not merely execution, but prolonged suffering performed as entertainment before tens of thousands of spectators. Crucifixion was used for the lowest classes and for enemies of the state, designed specifically to maximize the duration of suffering and the public visibility of the dying. On the military side, decimation was used to punish cowardice, or mutiny in military units. Every 10th soldier, chosen by lot, was beaten to death by his own comrades. Even the philosopher Seneca, writing in the 1st century CE, criticized torture's reliability as a truth-finding mechanism, making him one of the earliest recorded voices to argue that pain produces compliance, not honesty. Ancient China. Ancient China brought something that most other civilizations lacked to the practice of torture: meticulous bureaucratic codification. The Tang Code, issued in 653 CE, formally specified which torture instruments were legally permitted, under what circumstances they could be applied, and what limits governed their use. A legal framework for cruelty that reflects both the sophistication and the control obsession of imperial Chinese governance. 5 official punishment categories were recognized, ranging from light beating with a thin rod up through exile and death, with judicial torture used as a mechanism for extracting the confessions that were legally required before a sentence could be handed down. For the most serious crimes, particularly treason, the punishment was lingchi, known in the West as death by 1,000 cuts, practiced from roughly the 10th century onward. The method involved making repeated shallow cuts across the body, deep enough to cause intense pain, not deep enough to cause rapid blood loss, prolonging consciousness and suffering for as long as possible. In some documented variants, a wheel determined which body part was cut next, adding an element of randomized dread to the process. Lingxi was not abolished in China until 1905, and photographs from one of the final recorded executions circulated widely in Europe, where they caused significant public reaction. The Keng, a heavy wooden board locked around the neck like a portable stockade, was used for public humiliation and physical exhaustion simultaneously, forcing the wearer to rely on others even to eat or sleep. Ancient India. Ancient India produced one of the earliest written manuals on state torture in the form of the Arthashastra, a political treatise attributed to the scholar Kautilya, and written around 300 BCE as a guide for rulers of the Mauryan Empire. The text explicitly discussed interrogation by physical compulsion, listing approved methods that included burning, suspension, crushing limbs with heavy stones, forced consumption of substances, and sleep deprivation, a catalog of suffering framed as administrative policy. Punishment was not uniform across society. Caste status influenced what methods could legally be applied, with Brahmin men holding theoretical exemptions from physical torture in some legal traditions, while lower caste individuals faced the full range without legal protection. The most spectacular method associated with Indian royal punishment was elephant execution, called Gajamela, in which trained war elephants crushed condemned prisoners. The base version was swift, a single step to the skull. The extended version, reserved for particularly significant condemned individuals, involved training the elephant to avoid vital areas first, crushing limbs in sequence before the final blow, a process that could last a very long time in front of a royal audience. The Greek ambassador Megasthenes, who visited the Mauryan court around 300 BCE, left descriptions of Indian justice that suggest the system was both elaborate and brutal by the standards of any contemporary civilization. The Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, the eastern continuation of Rome that lasted until 1453 CE, developed torture into something almost refined, a surgical political instrument rather than mere punishment. The method that defines Byzantine political cruelty is blinding, applied repeatedly to deposed emperors, failed usurpers, and dangerous rivals throughout the empire's history. The logic was calculated. A blinded man was constitutionally disqualified from ruling, since physical wholeness was a requirement for imperial legitimacy, making blinding a way to neutralize a political threat without creating a martyr through execution. Nose-cutting served the same function and gave the Emperor Justinian II his nickname, Rhinot Metos, meaning the slit-nosed, after rivals removed his nose to disqualify him from power, a plan that famously failed when he returned, conquered Constantinople, and ruled again with a golden prosthetic nose. Beyond political mutilation, Byzantine dungeons employed the strappado, in which a prisoner's hands were tied behind their back, and they were hoisted by the wrists before being dropped sharply, dislocating both shoulders simultaneously without breaking the skin. As the empire became increasingly theocratic, religious heretics faced intensifying judicial torture, with the methods justified by the spiritual urgency of forcing recantation before the soul was lost entirely. The Islamic Caliphates. The Islamic Caliphates present a persistent and historically important gap between legal doctrine and political practice. Classical Islamic jurisprudence imposed extraordinarily high evidentiary standards for conviction, requiring multiple eyewitnesses for serious crimes, and mainstream legal scholars did not endorse torture as a valid means of extracting confessions, since a confession obtained through compulsion was considered legally unreliable. In theory, this should have meant a world without judicial torture. In practice, rulers and their prison administrators operated by entirely different rules. Bastinado, beating the soles of the feet, appears repeatedly in historical accounts of Abbasid-era prisons, and falaka, a variant using a wooden bar to hold the feet, immobile during beating, was documented across the region. Political prisoners under the Abbasid Caliphate were sometimes confined in oubliettes, narrow pits where a person could neither stand upright nor lie flat, a form of torture by confinement that left no visible marks and required no instruments. The distance between the legal ideal and the political reality was vast, and that distance is itself historically significant. It shows that even civilizations with explicit ideological objections to torture routinely practiced it the moment the state found it convenient. Medieval Europe. Medieval Europe transformed torture from a practice into an institution with the formalization of the Inquisition. Pope Innocent IV issued the papal bull Ad Extirpanda in 1252, formally authorizing torture as a tool for extracting confessions from suspected heretics, a significant reversal of earlier church prohibitions. The tools became iconic. The rack stretched the body until joints separated and ligaments tore. The strappado dislocated shoulders. Thumb screws applied compressive force to the fingers. The heretic's fork was a collar device with prongs at both ends that forced the head upright, causing the neck and jaw to be slowly pierced as muscles fatigued. Church rules technically prohibited drawing blood and imposed time limits on sessions, which led torturers toward methods that caused maximum pain through structural damage rather than cutting, a bureaucratic workaround that caused suffering while maintaining procedural compliance. In England, the peine forte et dure was applied to defendants who refused to enter a plea. The accused was pressed under incrementally added stone slabs until they spoke or died. On the popular misconception front, the Iron Maiden, that iconic spiked coffin, was largely a fabrication of the 18th and 19th centuries. Most examples in museums are theatrical reconstructions with no credible medieval origin. The Aztec Empire. The Aztec Empire operated on a fundamentally different philosophical basis than any other civilization in this list. Torture and death here were not primarily judicial or punitive, they were cosmological. The universe required human blood and human suffering to keep functioning, and the rituals that provided it were administered by priests rather than judges. The central method was live heart removal. The victim was bent backward over a sacrificial stone. A priest made a single rapid incision below the ribcage with an obsidian blade, and the still beating heart was torn free and raised toward the sun in offering to Huitzilopochtli. Death in this context was near instantaneous, which distinguished it from the prolonged suffering methods of other civilizations. Flaying, however, was different. During the Tlacaxepehualistli festival, dedicated to the god Jaipe Totec, victims were flayed alive and priests then wore their skins for days as a symbolic act of agricultural renewal, the earth shedding its old skin to allow new growth. The Florentine Codex, compiled by the Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún from Aztec informants after the conquest, documents these rituals in considerable detail. The scale of Aztec sacrifice remains genuinely disputed among historians. Spanish colonial accounts described enormous numbers that many modern scholars consider exaggerated for political purposes, but the ritual methods themselves are well attested. Feudal Japan. Feudal Japan had a confession problem. Under the Tokugawa shogunate's legal system, a verdict of guilty required a confession, and a confession that could not be obtained voluntarily could be obtained by other means. This made judicial torture not a deviation from the legal system, but a structural component of it. The approved methods were formally listed and theoretically regulated. Water torture, burning the soles of the feet with hot coals, and suspension in stress positions were among the documented techniques. The most distinctive Japanese method was ishitataki, applied specifically to pressure family members of suspects, rather than the suspects themselves. The subject was forced to kneel on sharp-edged stones or wooden wedges while heavy flat stone slabs were progressively stacked across their thighs, the weight increasing slowly until the pain became unbearable or the legs were crushed. It was a method designed to produce information through suffering inflicted on the innocent, which added a psychological dimension that purely self-directed torture couldn't achieve. Haritsuke, crucifixion, was used as public execution. Victims tied to crosses and displayed in public spaces, sometimes killed by spear thrusts, sometimes left to die from exposure. The Spanish Inquisition. The Spanish Inquisition is probably the most mythologized torture apparatus in Western history, and the reality diverges from the myth in almost every direction. Established in 1478 under Ferdinand and Isabella, it operated for over 350 years, and modern historians estimate that it executed somewhere between 3,000 and 5,000 people across its entire existence, far lower than popular imagination suggests, though the suffering of those thousands was real. The three formally approved torture methods were the garucha, which was the strappado, the tosa, which involved restraining the victim on a tilted board, covering the face with cloth, and pouring water over it to simulate drowning, a direct precursor to what the 21st century would call waterboarding, and the potro, a version of the rack, using cords that bit into the flesh as they were tightened. What made the Spanish Inquisition system unusual was its bureaucratic restraint on paper. A notary recorded every session verbatim. A physician monitored the proceedings, and torture was strictly time-limited. A confession extracted under torture had to be ratified the following day without coercion to be legally valid, and if the accused recanted, torture could be reapplied, but only once more. The gap between procedural rules and actual experience varied enormously by location and inquisitor, but the records that survive in Madrid's Archivo Histórico Nacional reveal something stranger than pure sadism, an institution that genuinely believed it was following rules while systematically breaking people. Colonial and early modern Europe. Colonial and early modern Europe represent the last era in which judicial torture operated openly before Enlightenment philosophy dismantled its legal legitimacy piece by piece. The breaking wheel was the defining public spectacle of this period. A large wagon wheel to which the condemned was bound spread-eagled, while an executioner used an iron bar to systematically shatter every major bone, working from the extremities inward, after which the wheel was mounted on a post, and the victim left to die over hours or days. France, Germany, and the Holy Roman Empire all used it extensively. Witch trials across Europe and the American colonies employed sleep deprivation, the ducking test, and pressing, with victims sometimes tortured into naming additional accused, creating cascading confessions that can consume entire communities. The intellectual reversal began in 1764 when the Italian philosopher Cesare Beccaria published On Crimes and Punishments, arguing systematically that torture was both morally wrong and epistemically useless. That pain produces compliance, not truth, and the text spread rapidly across Enlightenment Europe. Prussia's Frederick the Great abolished judicial torture in 1740. France followed in 1780, and England had largely discontinued it by the late 17th century. The abolition on paper typically ran decades ahead of abolition in practice, and informal torture in prisons and colonies continued long after the legislation changed, a pattern that has never entirely stopped repeating itself. Beer. Around 4000 BCE, in the river valleys between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the world's first civilization discovered that fermented grain could dissolve the boundary between the human and the divine, and then immediately began drinking itself to death with it. Beer in ancient Sumeria was not a luxury, not a treat, not something you saved for weekends. It was a caloric staple consumed by everyone from field laborers to high priests, woven so completely into the fabric of daily life that identifying it as dangerous was about as culturally conceivable as warning Sumerians about about the dangers of breathing. The Hymn to Ninkasi, composed around 1800 BCE, is one of the oldest written texts in human history, and it is simultaneously a religious hymn to the goddess of brewing and a working recipe for beer, which tells you everything you need to know about how Sumeria related to alcohol. The drink wasn't just present in religious life, it was the mechanism of religious life, the liquid through which mortals touch the sacred. State records from the city of Uruk document workers receiving between 1 and 5 liters of beer per day as part of their rations, meaning the laborers who built the monuments of the ancient world were doing so in a state of near constant intoxication, not by choice, but because the state was paying them in fermented grain. The Code of Hammurabi, the famous Babylonian legal code from around 1754 BCE, dedicates laws 108 through 111 specifically to regulating taverns, which were run almost exclusively by women and which the code treats as sites of social disorder, debt accumulation, and civic danger. The fact that Hammurabi felt compelled to legislate tavern behavior at this level of specificity tells you that alcohol-fueled social collapse was not a hypothetical concern, but an observed, recurring problem. Sumerian medical tablets describe conditions we would recognize immediately as symptoms of alcohol use disorder: the trembling hands, the confused thinking, the progressive inability to function, the social ruin that followed heavy drinkers through their communities. The specific danger of Sumerian beer culture was its invisibility as a danger. When a substance is woven into payment systems, religious ritual, and daily nutrition simultaneously, there's no cultural position from which to critique it. The priests who drank heavily during ceremonies were fulfilling their sacred duties. The workers who stumbled through their afternoons were simply living on their wages. And because the alcohol content of beer varied wildly depending on who brewed it, how long it fermented, and whether it was diluted with water before serving, a person could never be entirely sure what dose they were consuming on any given day. The intoxication was built into the civilization's operating system, invisible, normalized, and quietly devastating. Opium. The Ebers Papyrus, written around 1550 BCE and containing over 700 medical remedies, is one of the most important medical documents in human history, and it prescribed opium to crying children. That detail alone tells you how deeply opium had penetrated ancient Egyptian medicine, not as a last resort, not as a controlled substance handled with caution, but as a standard go-to remedy, the ancient equivalent of reaching for a bottle of children's medicine. The Egyptians had been cultivating the opium poppy since at least 3400 BCE, and they were not merely consumers. Egypt was a major node in the Mediterranean opium trade, both producing and distributing what Sumerians had called hulgil, meaning joy plant, a name borrowed across cultures because the experience it described was universally recognized. The opium trade moved through Cyprus, which served as a processing and redistribution hub, and ceramic vessels called base ring ware juglets, shaped distinctively like inverted poppy pods, have been found at New Kingdom burial sites, including Deir el-Bahri, confirming that Egyptians expected to need opium in the afterlife, which suggests they were using it heavily in this one. The fundamental danger of Egyptian opium use was structural. The line between medicine and intoxicant was not just blurred, it was non-existent. Physicians administering opium-based remedies to patients with chronic pain were inadvertently creating physical dependence in people who had no framework for understanding what was happening to them. There was no concept of addiction in ancient Egypt. There was only the medicine that worked and the increasingly desperate need for more of it. Soldiers may have used opium preparations before battle, according to some historical interpretations, which would have created a population of physically dependent veterans, returning from campaigns with no understanding of why they couldn't stop. Children sedated with opium-based remedies in infancy and childhood were the most vulnerable. The Ebers Papyrus's child-calming preparations represent some of the earliest documented instances of infant drugging in human history, carried out by parents and physicians acting in good faith according to the best medical knowledge available to them. The trade infrastructure compounding all of this was already sophisticated by the New Kingdom period, a supply chain stretching from poppy fields through maritime routes to Egyptian cities, with all the exploitation and profit motive that supply chains inevitably produce. Opium was shaping and damaging Egyptian bodies for more than 2 millennia before anyone thought to question whether that was a problem. Soma. The Rig Veda, one of the oldest religious texts in the world, compiled somewhere between 1500 and 1200 BCE, dedicates its entire 9th book, all 114 hymns of it, to a single subject, Soma, a pressed plant drink consumed by priests and gods alike during Vedic ritual. Over 120 references to Soma appear across the Rig Veda, describing a drink that produces euphoria, a felt sense of immortality, mobility, expanded perception, and surging physical energy, a profile that matches stimulant or psychedelic compounds more closely than alcohol. The actual identity of the Soma plant is one of the most genuinely unresolved mysteries in the history of pharmacology. The three leading candidates each have serious scholarly support. Ephedra, which contains ephedrine, a potent stimulant and cardiac stressor. Amanita muscaria, the red and white fly agaric mushroom, which produces muscimol-driven psychoactive effects, and cannabis, whose presence in the ancient world is well documented. In 1968, ethnomycologist R. Gordon Wasson published Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, arguing extensively for the Amanita muscaria theory, and while his thesis is influential, it is not a settled consensus. What is not in dispute is that Soma was consumed in substantial quantities during multi-day ceremonial events called Soma Yajnas, presided over by specialized priests called advaryos, who both prepared and drank the freshly pressed liquid. The danger embedded in this practice was theological rather than merely pharmacological. Soma was not a drug that happened to be used in religion. It was the mechanism of religion, the substance through which priests made contact with the divine, the drink that Indra himself consumed before slaying the cosmic serpent Vritra. Questioning whether Soma use was dangerous was, in the framework of Vedic religion, like questioning whether prayer was dangerous. There was no cultural lever to pull. If the ephedra identification is correct, the cardiac strain placed on priests consuming large amounts of ephedrine-rich liquid during physically and mentally demanding multi-day ceremonies would have been severe and real. As the Vedic period ended and the geographic sources of the original Soma plant became inaccessible, substitute plants were used in its place, meaning that later Soma ceremonies may have involved entirely different chemical compounds while maintaining the same ritual intensity, creating a situation where the dose was unknown, the substance was variable, and the sacred obligation to consume it was absolute. Cannabis. Hemp seeds have been found at Yangshao culture archaeological sites in China, dating to around 4000 BCE, making cannabis one of the longest-running relationships between a human civilization and a psychoactive plant anywhere on Earth. The plant appears in the Shennong Benkao Jing, a pharmacopoeia attributed to the legendary Emperor Shennong around 2700 BCE, though the text as it survives was compiled during the Han Dynasty, around 200 CE, which lists cannabis as effective against over 100 conditions, an astonishing therapeutic scope that reflects just how thoroughly the plant had been integrated into Chinese medicine over millennia. The Shennong Benkao Jing also warns, with unusual clarity for an ancient medical text, that overconsumption causes users to see demons and enter states of spirit communication, an early and remarkably accurate description of cannabis-induced psychosis in high-dose or vulnerable users. Taoist shamans called Fangxi burned cannabis in ritual censers, using the smoke to produce visionary states that enabled spirit contact and divination. This practice created a significant secondary exposure risk. Anyone present in an enclosed ritual space with burning cannabis was inhaling psychoactive compounds without consent or preparation, a form of involuntary intoxication that could have been genuinely destabilizing. Han Dynasty burial practices included cannabis-soaked shrouds, suggesting a belief that the plant's psychoactive properties were needed or useful in the transition to the afterlife, a detail that underscores how completely cannabis had been naturalized into Chinese spiritual cosmology. The ubiquity of the plant compounded its danger in a specific way. Cannabis in ancient China was also a food source, a textile fiber, and a medicine, meaning low-level ambient exposure was essentially unavoidable across the population. Hemp was eaten, worn, and burned across every social class, which created background pharmacological exposure that nobody was tracking or managing. The medical text instructions for therapeutic use, extended courses of treatment for chronic pain and inflammatory conditions, would have produced tolerance and withdrawal symptoms in patients who had no concept of dependence and no framework for interpreting what was happening to their bodies when they tried to stop. Alcohol. Ancient Greeks understood, at least in theory, that wine needed to be diluted with water in a ratio of roughly 3 parts water to 1 part wine, and that drinking it undiluted, ekritos, was the behavior of barbarians and madmen. They also built an entire civilization in which drinking wine undiluted, or nearly so, was a central social performance. The symposium, the elite Athenian drinking party that served as the primary venue for philosophy, poetry, political negotiation, and social bonding, was structured around mandatory communal drinking rounds enforced by an elected symposiarch whose job was to set the night's dilution ratio and ensure everyone kept pace. Xenophon's Symposium, and Plato's account of the same institution both document men drinking through the night, with the most admired participants being those who remained articulate and sharp, longest under the heaviest intoxication. The god presiding over all of this was Dionysus, not a minor deity but one of the 12 Olympians, whose worship in the Dionysian mysteries and the ecstatic bacchanalia rituals required drunkenness as a religious act, the deliberate dissolution of individual selfhood into divine communion. Hippocrates in his school documented wine-related illness with clinical specificity: tremors, cognitive deterioration, edema, and what reads in retrospect as cirrhosis, conditions that were widespread enough to warrant systematic medical attention. Plato, writing in the Laws, argued for strict age minimums for wine consumption and legal limits on quantity, a proposal that implies the problem was visible and serious enough to require legislative solutions. The Spartans had a particularly grim relationship with wine's social dangers. They regularly forced helots, the enslaved population of Laconia, to drink to extreme intoxication and then parade their degradation before Spartan youth as a moral lesson, weaponizing alcoholic excess as a tool of social control and class contempt. Homer's epics are saturated with wine and its consequences. The Cyclops episode in the Odyssey turns on Polyphemus being drunk, and the Iliad repeatedly frames wine as a mediator of both hospitality and catastrophic judgment. The wine-dark sea of Homer wasn't a poetic accident. It was a civilization telling you what color its whole world was: Kykeon. For nearly 2,000 years, from approximately 1500 BCE until the Christian emperor Theodosius the Venus banned all pagan rites in 392 CE, the most important religious ceremony in the ancient Greek world took place at a small town called Eleusis, 11 miles from Athens. Every year, thousands of initiates, including, at various points, Plato, Cicero, and Marcus Aurelius, made a torchlit pilgrimage to the Telesterian sanctuary, fasted for days in preparation, and then drank a barley and mint beverage called Kykeon. What happened after they drank it is described in terms so consistent across centuries of accounts that the experiences must have had a chemical cause: visions of death and resurrection, encounters with the goddess Persephone, a dissolution of the fear of dying so complete that Cicero described his initiation in De Legibus as having transformed his understanding of both life and death. For most of the mystery's history, historians assumed Kykeon was a mild symbolic drink, perhaps lightly fermented barley water with some ritual significance. Then in 1978, 3 researchers published a book called The Road to Eleusis that changed the conversation entirely. Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who had synthesized LSD in 1938 and knew its effects better than almost anyone alive, R. Gordon Wasson, the ethnomycologist, and classical scholar Carl Ruck argued together that Kykeon almost certainly contained ergotized barley, meaning barley infected with Claviceps purpurea, the ergot fungus that is the natural chemical precursor to lysergic acid, and therefore to LSD. If they are correct, and the theory remains debated but not dismissed, then the Eleusinian mysteries were a mass psychedelic ceremony conducted at scale for 2 millennia, with thousands of participants consuming potent psychoactive compounds annually in a ritual framework so sacred that disclosing what happened inside was punishable by death. The danger profile of ergot is not theoretical. Uncontrolled ergot exposure causes ergotism, known in medieval Europe as St. Anthony's fire, which produces convulsions, intense burning sensations in the extremities, vasoconstriction severe enough to cause gangrene, and death. The difference between a transformative visionary experience and a fatal overdose in ergot-based preparations is a matter of dose and preparation, and the ancient Greeks had no way to standardize either with precision. Any deaths or severe adverse reactions inside the mysteries were protected by the absolute vow of secrecy that initiates swore, meaning the true danger profile of Kykeon was effectively invisible to history. Chicha, the Inca Empire, was, among many things, the most sophisticated brewery operation in pre-Columbian history. Chicha, a fermented maize beer with a pale yellow color and a sour, slightly effervescent taste, was not a recreational product in the Inca world. It was a political currency, a religious sacrament, a labor payment, and a diplomatic instrument all at once. The state produced chicha at industrial scale through a network of kolkhas, massive storehouses, and specialized brewing facilities, the largest of which, at the administrative center of Huánuco Pampa in Peru, contained enough infrastructure to produce hundreds of liters daily for redistribution to workers, soldiers, and ceremony attendees. Production was managed by the Aklakuna, selected women known as Virgins of the Sun, who brewed chicha in state facilities as a form of sacred labor, binding the drink directly to religious authority and imperial power in a way that made questioning its consumption essentially equivalent to questioning the divine mandate of the Sapa Inca. Refusal to drink chicha offered by a social superior during Inca festivals, particularly the Great Solar Festival of Inti Raymi, was not merely impolite. It was a political offense, a rejection of the social bond that chicha consumption symbolized. The Mita labor system, through which the Inca state extracted work from subject populations, compensated workers partly in chicha, meaning chronic consumption was structurally built into the lives of the empire's working class with no opt-out available. The most disturbing evidence of chicha's role in Inca civilization came in 2013, when a study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences analyzed hair isotopes from the Iron Maiden, a child sacrifice victim found frozen on a 22,000-foot Argentine peak. The isotope data showed consistent alcohol consumption in the months before her death, increasing sharply in the final weeks of her life, suggesting that chicha was administered to sacrificial victims, possibly coercively, as preparation for ritual killing. The Capacocha ceremony, which involved the sacrifice of children to mountain deities, appears to have used both chicha and coca to sedate victims before death. For the vast majority of the Inca population, the danger of chicha was quieter and more chronic, a state-mandated intoxicant consumed at mandatory festivals and distributed as wages, producing the same hepatic damage, neurological erosion, and dependency patterns seen in modern alcohol use disorder, within a system that offered no legitimate path away from consumption. Cocaine. Coca leaves have been chewed in the Andes for at least 8,000 years. That figure comes not from legend but from archaeology. Carbonized coca leaves and the calcium-rich limestone paste used to activate their alkaloids have been found at Huaca Prieta, a coastal Peruvian site, in deposits dated to around 6000 BCE, making coca use in South America roughly contemporaneous with the earliest Mesopotamian city-states. The Inca did not discover coca. They inherited a relationship with the plant that was already ancient when their empire began, and what they did was industrialize and weaponize it. Under the reign of Pachacuti, who ruled from approximately 1438 to 1471 CE and essentially built the Inca Empire in its mature form, coca was formalized as a state-controlled substance, originally restricted to the Sapa Inca, the nobility, and the priesthood as a marker of sacred status. That restriction was progressively relaxed, not out of generosity but out of economic calculation. Coca suppresses hunger, dramatically reduces the symptoms of altitude sickness, and increases physical endurance, which made coca chewing laborers in the high-altitude silver and salt mines significantly more productive than workers without it. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived and began operating the Potosi silver mines from 1545 onward, they initially attempted to ban coca as a pagan practice, then reversed that position entirely when they realized coca chewing miners worked longer shifts and ate less, increasing profit margins. The Spanish weren't innovating this exploitation. They were continuing an Inca practice they had inherited with the empire. Coca is not cocaine in the refined pharmaceutical sense. Chewing leaves delivers cocaine alkaloids slowly and in combination with dozens of other plant compounds, producing a milder, more sustained stimulation than extracted cocaine. But the dependence profile of habitual leaf chewing is real. Extended use produces tolerance, and cessation produces withdrawal symptoms, including fatigue, depression, and intense craving. Andean mummies found throughout burial sites display worn teeth and the distinctive cheek bulge of habitual coca chewing, evidence of a cradle-to-grave practice that was both physically demanding on the body and spiritually mandatory, since coca was an offering to Pachamama, the Earth Mother, and to the Apus, the mountain spirits. Stopping was not simply a personal health choice. It was a spiritual and social rupture. The 2013 Pinus isotope study of the Iron Maiden showed coca consumption increasing dramatically in the year before her sacrifice, meaning the drug that organized Andean labor and economy was also the drug that prepared children for ritual death. Peyote. In 1957, archaeologists excavating Shumla Cave in southwestern Texas found peyote buttons, the dried crowns of the Lophophora williamsi cactus, in a burial context. Radiocarbon dating placed them at approximately 3700 BCE, making this among the oldest confirmed evidence of psychedelic plant use anywhere in the Americas. The people who placed those buttons in that grave understood what peyote did, which means the human relationship with mescaline. The primary psychoactive alkaloid in peyote is at least 5,700 years old. Mescaline constitutes roughly 1 to 6% of the dried cactus by weight, and the experience it produces at effective doses lasts between 8 and 12 hours, involving vivid open-eye hallucinations with complex geometric patterning, synesthesia, the blending of sensory inputs, Sounds experienced as colors, light experienced as texture. Intense emotional amplification, and at higher doses, a complete dissolution of ordinary selfhood into something vast and structureless. For the Huichol people, known traditionally as the Wixaritari, peyote was and remains the center of the most important ceremony in their religious calendar, the Hakuri Naksha, an annual pilgrimage to the sacred land of Wirikuta in the San Luis Potosi Desert that requires days of fasting and walking before the ritual consumption of peyote in quantities substantial enough to produce full visionary states. The fasting that precedes this ceremony is not incidental. Consuming a powerful psychedelic in a state of hypoglycemia from multi-day food restriction is a physiological stress multiplier, and without the cultural preparation, ceremonial structure, and experience guidance that traditional Huichol practice provides, the same experience could produce severe psychological destabilization. The Franciscan friar Bernardino de Sahagún, writing in the Florentine Codex in the mid-16th century, documented peyote use among indigenous Mexican populations with a mixture of horror and ethnographic precision, describing visions, weeping, and what he called much cruelty, which likely reflects his interpretation of the psychological intensity of the experience rather than literal violence. Spanish missionaries prosecuted peyote use as demonic practice well into the 18th century, driving ceremonies underground and inadvertently stripping away the cultural containment, the ritual protocols, experience guides, communal support structures that had managed peyote's potency for thousands of years. When that container broke, the drug's danger increased dramatically. The substance hadn't changed. The safety architecture around it had been dismantled. Psilocybin mushrooms. In 1502 CE, when Moctezuma II was crowned as the 9th Tlatoani of Tenochtitlan, reports suggest that the coronation feast included the distribution of Teonanacatl, meaning flesh of the gods in Nahuatl, psilocybin mushrooms of the psilocybe genus, to thousands of attendees simultaneously. Whether or not this specific account can be fully verified, the broader pattern it describes is thoroughly documented. Major Aztec state ceremonies, including war councils, coronations, and the festivals of Tezcatlipoca and Tlaloc, incorporated Teonanacatl as a sacramental substance, meaning that some of the most consequential political and military decisions in pre-Columbian history were made by leaders who were, at that moment, experiencing the full neurological effects of high-dose psilocybin. Psilocybin converts in the body to psilocin, which acts as a serotonin 2A receptor agonist, producing at high doses a complete dissolution of the boundary between self and world, encounters with entities or presences that feel more real than ordinary reality, and a profound distortion of time in which hours can feel like geological ages. None of this is chemically toxic in the way that alcohol or arsenic is toxic, but the psychological disruption of ego dissolution is profound, and in unprepared or psychologically vulnerable individuals, it can produce lasting trauma, psychosis-like states, and an inability to reintegrate into ordinary functioning. The most detailed account of a Teonanacatl ceremony in the ancient world comes from Bernardino de Sahagún's Florentine Codex, compiled between approximately 1540 and 1585 CE, which describes mushrooms eaten with honey in the early morning darkness, followed by visions of death and monsters, uncontrollable weeping, and encounters with supernatural presences, an account so consistent with modern clinical descriptions of high-dose psilocybin experiences that it reads almost like a case study. Human sacrifice was integrated into this same ritual complex. Both priests and sacrificial victims consumed Teonanacatl before the ceremony, making the drug an instrument of state violence administered to people who, in the case of victims, had no meaningful choice in the matter. The Spanish Inquisition prosecuted indigenous people for Teonanacatl use as late as the 18th century, driving the practice into secrecy and near extinction, until 1957, when R. Gordon Wasson participated in a Mazatec ceremony guided by the curandera Maria Sabina, 1894-1985, and published his account in Life magazine on May 13th of that year. That article reintroduced psilocybin mushrooms to the Western world, eventually catalyzing Timothy Leary, the 1960s counterculture, and the modern psychedelic research movement. The flesh of the gods that Aztec priests consumed in Tenochtitlan had traveled through secrecy and survival all the way to the cover of a magazine. Mandrake. Mandragora officinarum. The mandrake plant contains 3 tropane alkaloids, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, and atropine, and the combination produces a pharmacological profile that is both extraordinarily useful and extraordinarily easy to miscalibrate into death. At sublethal doses, mandrake produces sedation, pain relief, and amnesia, which made it valuable as a surgical anesthetic in a world without anesthesiology. At slightly higher doses, it produces vivid hallucinations and delirium. At higher doses still, it causes respiratory depression and death, and the therapeutic window, the gap between a dose that helps and a dose that kills, is so narrow that ancient practitioners working without any standardized measurement had essentially no reliable way to stay inside it. Dioscorides, the Greek physician writing around 65 CE in De Materia Medica, and Pliny the Elder in Naturalis Historia, both documented mandrake's medical applications with apparent confidence, recommending it for pain, insomnia, and as a pre-surgical sedative mixed with wine. Pliny also described the elaborate ritual believed necessary to safely harvest the root. You tied a dog to the plant, stepped back, and let the dog's death absorb the supernatural danger that the mandrake supposedly emitted when pulled from the ground. This myth, absurd on its face, reveals something important. It shows that Roman culture had a clear folk understanding that mandrake was lethally dangerous, and had built a ritual framework around that understanding, even if the mechanism was wrong. Roman poisoners understood the plant's real mechanism perfectly well. Mandrake's tastelessness, its ability to produce symptoms that mimicked natural illness, and its amnesiac properties, victims might not remember being dosed, made it one of the ancient world's most sophisticated murder weapons. The Emperor Claudius, who died in 54 CE, is among the historical figures sometimes associated with mandrake poisoning, with his wife Agrippina the Younger named in some ancient sources as having orchestrated a gradual poisoning campaign, though historians dispute whether the cause of death was mandrake, mushrooms, or something else entirely, and the account comes largely from Tacitus and Suetonius, who wrote with their own political agendas. Roman gladiatorial medicine used mandrake to manage the severe pain of arena injuries, keeping fighters functional in conditions that would otherwise be incapacitating, which meant the drug was also a tool for extracting maximum performance from damaged bodies in service of public entertainment. The human-shaped roots, the legend of the death scream when pulled from the earth, the entire mythological apparatus surrounding mandrake in Roman culture meant that its genuine pharmacological danger was encoded in folklore rather than medical caution, making rational harm reduction essentially impossible for ordinary people who encountered it. Arsenic. Arsenic trioxide, a white crystalline powder that is colorless in solution and almost completely tasteless, is the most democratically dangerous substance in this entire list because it was simultaneously a medicine, a cosmetic, a poison, and a spiritual technology across multiple ancient civilizations with no communication between them. The Shenong Benqiao Jing, the foundational Chinese pharmacopoeia, lists arsenical compounds as therapeutic agents, a recommendation that was not entirely irrational. Small doses of arsenic do kill certain parasites, reduce some skin conditions, and may produce short-term effects that ancient practitioners interpreted as revitalization. But chronic exposure to arsenic, even at low doses, causes arsenicosis, a progressive systemic poisoning that produces thickening and darkening of the skin, peripheral nerve damage with burning and numbness in the extremities, damage to the liver and kidneys, and cancer of the bladder, lung, and skin. The symptoms accumulate slowly over years, which meant that patients taking arsenic-based medicines for chronic conditions were being poisoned in such gradual increments that neither they nor their physicians connected the medicine to the deterioration. In Taoist alchemical tradition, arsenical compounds featured prominently in jindan, golden elixir preparations consumed by emperors and aristocrats in pursuit of immortality or extended life. Multiple Tang dynasty emperors ruling in the period between approximately 618 and 907 CE are believed by historians to have died of heavy metal poisoning from these elixirs, with Emperor Taizong's death in 649 CE sometimes cited in this context, though the specific attribution requires care because ancient Chinese medical records are not always unambiguous about cause of death. The supreme irony of the immortality elixir tradition is its outcome. The emperors most desperately seeking eternal life were consuming, in the substances meant to grant it, the precise compounds that were killing them. In Rome, the arsenic story ran through a different channel. Aristocratic Roman women used lead in arsenic-based cosmetic preparations to whiten their skin, a beauty standard associated with wealth and indoor leisure as opposed to the sun-darkened skin of outdoor laborers. Ovid addressed cosmetic preparations in Medicamina Faciae Feminae, documenting the range of substances used in beauty routines, and while the specific arsenic content of various preparations varied, the broader pattern of chronic topical and ingested heavy metal exposure among Roman women of the upper class was real and cumulative. Meanwhile, arsenic's properties as a poison were well enough understood that Roman assassination culture relied on it heavily. Colorless, tasteless, producing symptoms indistinguishable from the gastrointestinal illnesses that killed people regularly in the ancient world. Arsenic was the perfect crime weapon in a world without toxicology. It would later earn the nickname inheritance powder in Renaissance and early modern Europe because of its usefulness in accelerating the reading of wills, but that reputation was built on a foundation laid in the ancient world. The same substance that Taoist priests were drinking in pursuit of immortality, that Roman women were rubbing into their skin for beauty, and that Roman poisoners were slipping into wine cups, was a single white powder, invisible in water, working the same slow chemistry on every body it entered, regardless of what the person taking it believed they were receiving. Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization wedged between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, was also one of the first places humans bothered to write down exactly how they felt about sex, and they felt pretty good about it. Dating back to roughly 3500 BCE, Sumerian and Babylonian cultures did not treat sexuality as shameful or secretive. Instead, it was woven directly into religion, law, and daily life with a matter-of-fact openness that would make many later civilizations deeply uncomfortable. The goddess Ishtar, deity of love, fertility, and war, was one of the most powerful figures in the entire Mesopotamian pantheon, and her temples were centers of both worship and what some historians have described as sacred prostitution, though that term is heavily debated. Some scholars argue the women called Kadishtu or Nadatu, who served in Ishtar's temples, functioned more as ritual specialists than sex workers in any modern sense, and the exact nature of their role remains genuinely contested. What isn't contested is that the world's oldest surviving erotic literature comes from this region. The Epic of Gilgamesh, written around 2100 BCE, includes a scene where the wild man Enkidu is civilized, specifically through a week of sex, with a woman named Shamhat, presented not as degradation, but as his entry into humanity. Law, meanwhile, handled sex with the same bureaucratic precision the Babylonians applied to grain prices. The Code of Hammurabi, issued around 1754 BCE, specified that adultery by a wife was punishable by drowning for both her and her lover, though a husband could choose to spare them. Concubines had legally defined rights and statuses. Certain Assyrian law tablets appear to penalize specific male-on-male acts, though same-sex relationships appear elsewhere in Mesopotamian texts without obvious condemnation, suggesting that as with most things in this region, the details depended heavily on who you were, what role you played, and whether anyone with power objected. Ancient Egypt. Ancient Egypt, which flourished for over 3,000 years along the Nile, took a remarkably relaxed approach to sexuality by the standards of almost any era. Sex was considered natural, life-giving, and tied to the fundamental forces of creation, not a source of guilt. The god Min, depicted in temple carvings with a permanent erection and worshipped openly during harvest festivals, was one of the most widely venerated deities in the entire Egyptian religious system. Fertility wasn't whispered about. It was celebrated on 30-foot temple walls in full view of the public. The Turin Erotic Papyrus, dating to around 1150 BCE and now held in Turin's Egyptian Museum, depicts a series of explicit sexual scenes in a style so casual and humorous it resembles a comic strip. Scholars still debate whether it was satirical, instructional, or simply entertainment, but its existence confirms that explicit sexual imagery circulated in Egyptian society without obvious scandal. Egyptians also made serious attempts at contraception. The Ebers Papyrus, a medical text from around 1550 BCE, describes pessaries made from mixtures including acacia, honey, and what appears to be crocodile dung, inserted to prevent pregnancy. Whether they worked is a different question, but the attempt reflects a sophisticated and practical attitude toward managing reproduction. Among the royalty, incest was not taboo but idealized. Pharaohs sometimes married sisters or half-sisters to maintain divine bloodlines and consolidate power, a practice exemplified most famously by Cleopatra VII, who married two of her younger brothers in succession, though these were political arrangements rather than romantic ones. Women in Egypt had more legal standing than in most ancient civilizations, including the right to divorce, and adultery, while frowned upon, did not automatically carry a death sentence. Ancient Greece. Ancient Greece produced one of the most intellectually analyzed and socially complex sexual cultures in history, and understanding it requires immediately abandoning the idea that their categories resembled ours in any way. What mattered in Greek sexual ethics was not the gender of your partner, but your social role, your age, and, critically, whether you were the active or passive participant. For a freeborn male citizen, being the active partner in any sexual act was acceptable. Being the passive partner was considered degrading, effeminate, and socially damaging, regardless of who the other person was. This framework produced the institution of pederasty, a formal relationship between an older man, Erastus, and an adolescent boy, Eromenos, which was openly practiced in many city-states and framed as educational and mentoring in nature, the older man was supposed to guide the boy into civic virtue. How physical these relationships were in practice varied enormously by city-state and period, and modern ethical judgments here are both obvious and necessary. At the symposium, the elite drinking party that was the center of Athenian intellectual and social life, two categories of women circulated: pornai, common prostitutes, and hetairae, educated courtesans who occupied a genuinely peculiar position in Greek society. A hetaira like Aspasia, who was the companion of the statesman Pericles, was credited by ancient writers with intellectual influence over Athenian politics, more respected in many ways than a citizen's wife, who was expected to remain at home, manage the household, and have essentially no public presence whatsoever. Sappho of Lesbos, writing around 600 BCE, produced poetry of intense erotic feeling directed at women, and the words lesbian and sapphic derived directly from her name and island, making her perhaps the most linguistically influential poet in Western history. Ancient Rome. Ancient Rome inherited much of Greece's sexual framework, and then bureaucratized it with characteristic Roman thoroughness. The central organizing principle was dominance. A freeborn Roman male citizen was expected at all times to be the penetrating party in any sexual encounter. The gender or legal status of his partner mattered far less than his role. Passivity was for slaves, prostitutes, and foreigners, not for citizens. This meant that a Roman man having sex with another man was not inherently scandalous, provided he was the active partner and his partner was of appropriately low status. The city of Pompeii, preserved under volcanic ash from the 79 CE eruption of Vesuvius, gives us extraordinary physical evidence of Roman sexual culture. Lupinaria, or brothels, have been excavated with painted scenes above the doorways of individual rooms functioning essentially as menus, and phallic symbols were carved into street pavements as good luck charms and directional markers. Slaves had no legal sexual autonomy whatsoever and were entirely available to their masters by law. Emperor Augustus attempted to impose moral reform with the Lex Iulia de Adulterius around 18 BCE, making adultery a criminal offense for the first time and requiring husbands to divorce and prosecute adulterous wives, though the law was applied wildly inconsistently, and Augustus himself was accused of adultery by his contemporaries. The poet Ovid wrote the Ars Amatoria, a cheerful instructional manual on seduction, around the same time, and was eventually exiled by Augustus, partly for it. The god Priapus, depicted with a grotesquely oversized permanent erection, was placed in Roman gardens as a fertility charm and a warning to thieves, the threat being explicit and anatomical. Ancient China. Ancient China developed one of the world's most sophisticated theoretical frameworks around sexuality, rooted in Taoist cosmology. Sex was not merely physical pleasure or reproduction. It was, according to Taoist texts, compiled from roughly the Han Dynasty onward, 206 BCE, 220 CE, a means of balancing the opposing cosmic forces of yin and yang within the body. The Fengzhong Shu, or bedroom arts, were a formal field of medical and philosophical study. Texts like The Secrets of the Jade Chamber and The Classic of the Plain Girl gave detailed instruction on sexual technique, timing, and posture, with the underlying theory that men could cultivate health and longevity by absorbing female yin energy during intercourse, ideally while conserving their own yang energy by limiting or avoiding ejaculation. This gave Chinese erotic literature a peculiarly clinical, self-improvement quality, unlike almost anything produced in the West. The imperial harem represented the institution taken to its logical extreme. Emperors of the Tang and Ming dynasties maintained harems of thousands of women organized into strict bureaucratic hierarchies, with complex systems for scheduling the emperor's nightly visits and recording which women he slept with to track potential pregnancies. Same-sex relationships appear consistently throughout Chinese historical records and were generally tolerated, even romanticized in certain periods. The phrase "the passion of the cut sleeve" entered the language from a story about Emperor Ai of Han, who around 1 BCE reportedly cut off his sleeve rather than wake his sleeping male favorite. Foot binding, practiced from roughly the Song dynasty, 960 CE, onward until its prohibition in 1912, became deeply intertwined with female sexuality and desirability. The bound foot was considered intensely erotic, a marker of refinement that also functioned as a physical constraint on women's movement and independence. Ancient India. Ancient India produced what is arguably the world's most famous sex manual, and almost everything the West thinks it knows about it is wrong. The Kama Sutra, compiled by the scholar Vatsyayana sometime between the 2nd and 4th centuries CE, is not primarily a catalog of sexual positions. It is a comprehensive guide to living a sophisticated, fulfilling life, in which sexual pleasure, kama, is recognized as one of 4 legitimate goals of human existence, alongside dharma, moral duty; artha, material prosperity; and moksha, spiritual liberation. The physical instructions occupy only a portion of the text. The rest covers topics including how to furnish a home, how to behave in social situations, and how to conduct a romantic relationship. The temples at Khajuraho in central India, constructed between roughly 950 and 1050 CE, display the same philosophy in stone. Their famous erotic carvings cover only a fraction of the exterior surfaces, amid representations of gods, celestial beings, and daily life, and are understood by scholars as representations of cosmic union and the sacred nature of earthly pleasure, rather than decoration for its own sake. The Devadasi system, in which women were dedicated to temple service with ritual roles that in some cases included sexual elements, is documented across several centuries, though its exact nature and scope are contested by modern historians. Colonial-era British sources significantly distorted the record. Caste and ritual purity governed sexual boundaries with enormous social force. Relationships across caste lines carried severe consequences, a reality that ancient legal texts like the Manusmriti regulated in exhaustive detail. The Aztecs. The Aztecs present one of history's most striking contradictions, an official sexual morality of remarkable strictness, existing alongside a religious life saturated with explicit sexual symbolism. Young people attending the Kalmakak and Telpakali schools, the elite priestly academies and the common warrior schools, received extensive formal lectures on sexual restraint called Huehuetlatali, or Sayings of the Elders, which emphasized that premature sexual activity would drain a young man's strength and cloud his judgment. Premarital sex was officially condemned. Adultery was punishable by death, typically stoning or strangulation depending on the social status of those involved, and the punishment was applied to both parties. And yet, sitting at the center of Aztec religious life was Tlazolteotl, the goddess of filth, excess, and sexual sin, who was simultaneously the goddess of purification and absolution. Her priests offered a form of confession available once in a lifetime, during which a person could unburden themselves of every sexual transgression they had ever committed and receive complete ritual cleansing. The practical implication, which Aztec moralists reportedly acknowledged with some frustration, was that people sometimes saved their confessions, and therefore their worst behavior, for old age. Aztec mythology, filtered through sources written after the Spanish conquest of 1521 and therefore viewed through a colonial religious lens that almost certainly distorted the record, describes gods engaged in acts of transgression, dismemberment, and sexual violence that functioned as cosmological events rather than scandals. Almost everything we know about Aztec sexual culture comes through Spanish colonial priests, who were simultaneously fascinated and horrified. A filter that makes certainty difficult: the Vikings. The Vikings, whose raiding and trading networks stretched from North America to Constantinople between roughly 793 and 1100 CE, had a sexual culture organized around a single overriding value: the performance of masculinity. Norse law, particularly the Icelandic Gragas Code, was extraordinarily specific about sexual matters in ways that occasionally surprise modern readers. A wife had legally recognized grounds for divorce if her husband consistently failed to satisfy her sexually, or if he wore clothing considered effeminate, both treated as failures of the masculine duty he owed her. The concept of ergi was one of the most serious insults in the Norse world, implying that a man had taken a passive sexual role, which was understood to make him less than fully a man, and could in some contexts strip him of legal standing. Concubinage through the institution of the frilla was legally recognized. A frilla was not a wife, but occupied a defined social role, and her children had inheritance rights under certain circumstances. Norse mythology, meanwhile, is quietly one of the most sexually chaotic bodies of religious literature ever produced. Odin cross-dresses and practices satyr magic, a form of shamanism associated with women, which his fellow gods mock him for. Loki shapeshifts into a mare, mates with a stallion, and gives birth to Sleipnir, Odin's eight-legged horse. Freyr, the fertility god, was worshipped with large phallic statues and presided over marriage, harvests, and rain. The gods' sex lives, in other words, were as complicated and contradictory as the humans who invented them. Feudal Japan. Feudal Japan produced what might be the world's most aesthetically sophisticated erotic culture, one in which explicit sexual content was simultaneously art, commerce, medicine, and good luck charm. The tale of Genji, written around 1000 CE by the noblewoman Murasaki Shikibu, and widely considered the world's first novel, centers on the romantic and sexual adventures of a prince, and is unflinching in depicting depicting seduction tactics that by modern standards constitute sexual coercion, presented in the Heian court aesthetic as elegant romantic pursuit. Shunga, the genre of explicit woodblock prints that flourished during the Edo period from 1603 to 1868, were not considered obscene or shameful. They were exchanged as wedding gifts, tucked into samurai armor as protective talismans, collected by women, monks, and merchants alike, and produced by the greatest artists of the era, including Hokusai and Utamaro. The male same-sex tradition of shudo, or wakashudo, was formalized particularly among samurai and Buddhist monks, structured around a relationship between an older man and a younger one that carried explicit codes of loyalty, aesthetic refinement, and emotional depth, considered by its practitioners entirely compatible with honor and martial virtue. The licensed pleasure districts, of which Yoshiwara and Edo established in 1617, is the most famous, were walled, carefully regulated urban zones where the hierarchy among women was elaborate. At the top, the Taiyu, an elite courtesan of such status that she could refuse any client regardless of his wealth or rank, and who was expected to be accomplished in music, poetry, and conversation as much as anything else. Medieval Europe. Medieval Europe presents the most familiar framework to Western audiences and also one of the most thoroughly misunderstood. The Catholic Church's official position was unambiguous. Sex was permissible only within marriage, only for the purpose of reproduction, and ideally with as little pleasure as possible, because pleasure itself was suspected of being spiritually dangerous. Penitential manuals, which were guides for priests hearing confession, listed dozens of specific sexual acts and assigned precise penances for each, creating what amounts to an inadvertent encyclopedia of medieval sexual behavior. The gap between official teaching and actual behavior was, however, enormous. Clergy were legally required to be celibate and were notoriously, persistently, not. Pope Alexander VI and the Borgia Pope, who reigned from 1492 to 1503, acknowledged multiple illegitimate children and reportedly held banquets at the Vatican that his contemporaries described as spectacularly debauched, though some accounts are likely exaggerated by enemies. The popular image of iron chastity belts locked by crusading husbands is almost certainly a myth. Most surviving examples appear to date from the 16th century or later and were likely novelty items or created for museums rather than actual use. In rural communities, a practice called bundling allowed unmarried courting couples to sleep in the same bed, separated by a board or tied in separate blankets, a pragmatic accommodation to cold houses and limited space that was tolerated as controlled courtship. The witch trial literature, particularly the Malleus Maleficarum of 1487, reveals the era's deepest anxieties. Its obsessive, detailed treatment of women's sexuality, demonic intercourse, and the theft of male potency reflects not a description of reality, but a profound institutional terror of female desire that the Church had spent centuries failing to suppress. The Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire, which at its peak stretched from Vienna to the Persian Gulf, is perhaps no historical institution more thoroughly distorted by outside fantasy than the imperial harem. The word harem derives from the Arabic haram, meaning sacred or forbidden, and the institution was primarily a domestic space. The private household of elite women, children, servants, and eunuch administrators, governed not by the Sultan, but by the Valid Sultan, his mother, who wielded genuine political power over hundreds of residents. Of the hundreds of women who might live in Topkapi Palace's harem at any given time, only a small number ever had direct contact with the Sultan himself. The elaborate hierarchy of the harem, from raw recruits to trained odalisques to Gozdi, those who had caught the Sultan's eye, to Haseki, those who had borne him children, was as rigid and political as any European court. Concubinage was legally sanctioned under Islamic law. In addition to up to 4 wives, a Muslim man could take slave concubines, and a concubine who bore him a child gained significantly elevated legal status and could not be sold. In practice, the institution concentrated enormous numbers of women in the households of the wealthy and made the female slave trade economically central to the empire for centuries. Ottoman classical poetry, meanwhile, celebrated male same-sex love with a directness that surprises readers unfamiliar with the tradition. The idealized beloved in divan poetry is often ambiguously or explicitly male, presented through an aesthetic of idealized beauty that operated somewhat separately from legal and religious restrictions. European Orientalist sources from the 18th and 19th centuries, written by men who never entered a harem and were projecting their own fantasies, are responsible for most of the mythology that still circulates today. The Renaissance. The Renaissance, flowering across Italy from roughly 1400 and spreading through Europe into the 1600s, did not liberate sexuality so much as relocate it, from the theological to the aesthetic. The nude human body returned to art for the first time since antiquity, and classical mythology provided an inexhaustible supply of excuses to depict it. Venus rising from the sea, laden with the swan, Ganymede carried off by Jupiter. Yet beneath the marble and the oil paint, prosecutions were escalating. Florence established the Office of the Knight in 1432, specifically to investigate and prosecute male same-sex acts. And over its 70 years of operation, it implicated thousands of men, including in 1476 a young Leonardo da Vinci, who was anonymously accused of sodomy with a male model. The charge was eventually dropped, and Leonardo's actual sexual life remains unknown, but the accusation illustrates how official condemnation and widespread practice coexisted in the same city at the same moment. The first mass-produced pornography in European history appeared in 1524. Pietro Aretino's Chiarimodi, a series of explicit engravings by Marcantonio Raimondi paired with Aretino's erotic sonnets, was immediately suppressed by Pope Clement VII and immediately reprinted, distributed, copied, and translated across the continent. Courtesans in Venice and Rome occupied a strange and specific cultural position. The most successful, like the poet Veronica Franco, hosted intellectual salons, corresponded with kings, and published their own writing, existing in a social space that citizen wives could never access. And threading through all of it was syphilis, which arrived in epidemic form across Europe around 1495 following Columbus's return. The Columbian exchange theory for its origin remains dominant, though debated, and within a generation had killed or disfigured enough people to permanently reshape European attitudes toward casual sex, in ways that sermons alone never quite managed.
Crushing by elephant. For centuries across the Mughal Empire, ancient India, and much of Southeast Asia, the elephant wasn't just a symbol of royal power, it was the instrument of it. Rulers kept specially trained Asian elephants as state executioners, directed mid-execution by a mahout, or elephant trainer, who controlled the animal through verbal commands and physical cues. The condemned would be dragged into a public space, often a courtyard or open ground in front of gathered crowds, and the execution would unfold in one of two very distinct ways, depending entirely on what the ruler wanted to communicate that day. For a swift message, the mahout directed the elephant to place one massive foot directly onto the criminal's skull, ending everything in a single, thunderous instant, under an estimated force of several tons of concentrated pressure. For a slower message, when the court wanted the crowd to understand the full consequences of defiance, the elephant was trained to begin with the limbs, methodically crushing arms, then legs, then working inward, the animal pausing between each step while the victim remained fully conscious. The genius of this method from a ruler's perspective was its total demonstration of dominance. Here was a creature of nature itself, the largest land animal on earth, bending entirely to royal will and destroying a human being with almost casual ease. No executioner, no machinery, no blade, just raw, obedient weight. Chinese, European, and Middle Eastern travelers who witnessed these executions recorded their horror in detail, and yet the practice persisted because it worked exactly as intended. Crucifixion. Crucifixion is often thought of as a Roman invention, but the practice originated earlier in the Persian Empire, where it was used to display conquered enemies and traitors along major roads as permanent, decaying warnings to anyone who passed. The Romans inherited the method and transformed it into a precise science of prolonged suffering, reserving it specifically for non-citizens, slaves, rebels, and enemies of the state, since Roman law explicitly protected citizens from this particular fate. The mechanics of death by crucifixion are grimly specific. The condemned was secured to a wooden crossbeam, typically through the wrists rather than the palms, since the palms cannot support body weight without tearing, and through the feet. Hanging there, the entire weight of the body pulled downward, compressing the chest and making exhaling nearly impossible. To breathe, the victim had to push upward against the nails through their feet, lifting their own body weight with already exhausted muscles just to force air out of their lungs. This cycle, push up to breathe, collapse back down, push up again, continued for hours or sometimes days, while the sun, dehydration, blood loss, and progressive muscle failure all worked simultaneously. Roman roads leading into major cities were often lined with crosses during periods of suppression, turning execution into infrastructure, death as architecture, bodies as signposts. The crucifixion of approximately 6,000 survivors of the Third Servile War under Spartacus in 71 BC, along the Appian Way, stretched for over 200 kilometers. Poena Culae. Rome had brutal punishments for many crimes, but parricide, the murder of a parent or close relative, was considered so unnatural, so cosmically wrong, that ordinary execution wasn't considered sufficient. The poena culae, or penalty of the sack, was designed not just to kill but to erase. Before the criminal even reached the sack, the ritual humiliation began. They were severely beaten, their head wrapped in a wolf skin, and their feet encased in wooden shoes, symbolic materials rooting them in the animal world, stripping them of their human identity. Then came the sack itself, a heavy, waterproof leather bag into which the condemned was sewn alongside 4 live animals, a dog, a rooster, a viper, and a monkey, each believed to carry symbolic resonance connected to the nature of the crime, though ancient sources disagree on the precise symbolism of each animal. Sealed inside with creatures that were equally terrified and increasingly violent, the criminal was then thrown into a river or the sea. The design ensured they would never touch the earth again. No burial, no rites, no contact with the natural world they had violated by committing the most unnatural act imaginable. The sack would thrash and sink, and whatever happened inside happened in darkness and silence beneath the water. Roman legal scholars wrote about this punishment with a kind of grim poetry, describing it as a fitting mirror for a crime that had placed the criminal outside of nature entirely. The Brazen Bull. In the 6th century BC, a metalworker named Perillus of Athens approached Phalaris, the tyrant of Acragas in what is now Sicily, with a proposal he believed would earn him great favor: a hollow bronze bull, life-sized, fitted with a door in its side. A criminal would be locked inside, a fire would be lit beneath the belly, and the metal would heat until the person within was effectively baked alive by the radiating bronze surrounding them on all sides. What made Perillus proud of his design, and what makes it uniquely horrifying in retrospect, was the engineering detail he considered his masterpiece: a system of internal pipes and acoustic stops built into the bull's head that would channel the screams of the dying victim outward through the nostrils and mouth, converting them into something that sounded, to the crowd outside, exactly like the bellowing of an angry bull. The screams of the condemned became the performance. Ancient sources, including Pindar and Diodorus Siculus, report that Phalaris was impressed, but immediately had Perillus himself locked inside to test it, making the inventor the device's first victim, though whether this account is fully historical or carries a layer of moral legend is debated by scholars. Death inside would have come from a combination of severe burns, thermal radiation from every surrounding surface, and eventual oxygen depletion as the fire beneath consumed the air. Lingqi, formalized during the Song dynasty and practiced in Imperial China until its abolition in 1905 during the final years of the Qing dynasty. Lingqi, translated variously as death by 1,000 cuts, or slow slicing, was reserved exclusively for the most severe violations of the Confucian social order: treason against the emperor, or patricide against one's own family. The method required a highly skilled executioner, because the goal was not to kill quickly, but to remove uniform slices of flesh from the chest, thighs, arms, and muscles in a controlled, methodical sequence, each cut calculated to cause maximum pain, without accidentally severing a vessel that would end the process too soon. The physical suffering was extraordinary, but for the condemned and for the audience watching, the deeper horror was spiritual. Confucian belief held that the body must be buried whole to ensure peace in the afterlife. A body systematically cut to pieces would remain fragmented and spiritually dishonored beyond death, a punishment that extended past the moment of dying into eternity. Photographs from some of the final documented Lingqi executions in the late 19th and early 20th century still exist and circulated widely among Western observers at the time, producing a particular kind of horrified fascination that contributed to international pressure for the practice's abolition alongside the broader legal reforms of 1905. Impalement. The Ottoman Empire and the medieval rulers of Eastern Europe both made extensive use of impalement, but no name is more permanently attached to it than Vlad III of Wallachia, known in his own time as Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, who ruled in the 15th century and whose campaigns against Ottoman forces and internal enemies produced scenes that stunned even veteran soldiers on both sides. The stake was driven upward through the body from the base, and the critical technical detail was that it was deliberately angled and positioned to avoid immediately piercing any vital organ. The condemned was then raised upright, and their own body weight did the rest, gradually, over hours or days, driving the stake slowly deeper as muscles exhausted and the body sank. Death came from internal hemorrhaging, infection, dehydration, or simple organ failure, once the stake eventually reached something vital. Vlad reportedly arranged his victims in geometric formations around his territory, forests of the dead meant to communicate a single message to advancing Ottoman forces. Contemporary Ottoman accounts record that Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople just years earlier, turned his army around upon encountering one such scene. The exact numbers attributed to Vlad's executions vary wildly across historical sources and are disputed by modern historians. but the psychological impact of the method was, by any account, precisely as intended: boiling to death. Boiling to death appears independently across multiple civilizations, in parts of Asia, the Middle East, and medieval Europe, but it reached its most legally formalized expression in England under King Henry VIII, who in 1531 passed the Act of Poisoning, making boiling the mandatory and specific punishment for those convicted of poisoning or coining, the counterfeiting of currency. The method existed in two variants, and the choice between them was itself a form of additional punishment. In the direct method, the condemned was lowered into a cauldron of already boiling liquid, water, oil, tallow, or in some recorded cases molten lead, and death, while still agonizing, came within minutes as the extremities were destroyed first and the heat worked inward. In the cold start variant, the criminal was placed into a cold vat and the liquid was heated gradually from beneath, extending the experience of systemic pain across a much longer period as the temperature rose degree by degree. The nerve endings in the fingers and toes, densely packed with sensory receptors, registered damage first. Then the skin began to separate, the fat and muscle tissue softened and began to break down, and the body's core temperature rose beyond any survivable threshold. The act of poisoning remained on the English books as a specific legal provision until it was quietly subsumed into broader criminal law reforms in the 19th century. Keel hauling. Formalized in the Dutch Navy's official legal code during the 16th century, and later adopted in various forms across European fleets, keel hauling was specifically designed for the maritime context, a punishment so severe it served as an absolute deterrent in an environment where mutiny or serious crime could doom an entire ship and crew hundreds of miles from any shore. The condemned sailor was tied to a rope, weighted down to ensure they sank rather than floated, and then dragged completely underwater from one side of the ship to the other, passing beneath the keel, the lowest, widest point of the hull. The drowning risk alone would have been sufficient to kill many, but the secondary mechanism was the ship's underbelly itself, which after any time at sea became encrusted with thousands of barnacles, each with edges sharp enough to function like serrated blades. Being dragged across this surface at speed lacerated and in some cases partially flayed the sailor's skin and flesh. If the victim survived the first pass, either by remarkable endurance or by the crew pulling too quickly, the standard procedure in many documented cases was simply to repeat it. Those few who survived keel hauling were permanently disfigured, which was understood to be part of the punishment's communicative function aboard a ship where every crew member would see the result daily. The guillotine. When Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotine proposed his device to the French National Assembly in 1789, he framed it explicitly as a humanitarian reform. Before the Revolution, the quality of your death in France depended entirely on your social class. The wealthy could pay for a skilled swordsman and a clean, fast decapitation, while the poor faced hanging, breaking on the wheel, or worse. The guillotine's heavy-angled blade, dropped from a measured height along greased wooden rails, was designed to sever the spinal cord and both carotid arteries in a fraction of a second, delivering identical, standardized death to every condemned person, regardless of whether they were a nobleman or a beggar. Introduced officially in 1792, it almost immediately became the engine of the Reign of Terror between 1793 and 1794, during which an estimated 16,000 to 40,000 people were executed, with the guillotine processing multiple condemned per day in Paris alone, turning capital punishment into something closer to an administrative procedure. Dr. Guillotin himself was reportedly appalled by how his humanitarian proposal had been deployed and spent years afterward attempting, unsuccessfully, to have his name formally disassociated from the device. France continued using the guillotine as its official execution method until the abolition of the death penalty in 1981, with the last guillotine execution carried out in 1977 on Hamida Jandoubi. Hanging, drawing, and quartering. Reserved in medieval and early modern Britain for men convicted of high treason, this punishment was not a single act but a carefully sequenced process designed to inflict maximum suffering across multiple stages while keeping the condemned alive through most of them. The convicted traitor was first tied to a wooden hurdle and dragged behind a horse through the streets to the execution site, a public journey of deliberate humiliation through crowds. There he was hanged by the neck but cut down while still alive and conscious. His genitals were then removed and burned in front of him, followed by disembowelment, with the organs removed while the heart still beat. Beheading came next, and finally the body was divided into 4 quarters, each sent to a different prominent location: a city gate, a bridge, a castle entrance, where they would remain on display, typically preserved in tar, as a warning visible to thousands. The head was usually displayed separately on a spike above London Bridge or another landmark. The punishment remained technically on the books in England until the Forfeiture Act of 1870, though the full sequence of all stages became increasingly rare in practice long before that, with later executions often limiting themselves to hanging and posthumous beheading. The Iron Maiden. The Iron Maiden of Nuremberg is among the most debated artifacts in the history of execution. Long presented in museums and popular imagination as a genuine medieval torture and execution device, the Iron Maiden, a human-shaped iron cabinet lined with interior spikes, became the subject of serious historical scrutiny in the 19th and 20th centuries, with a significant number of historians arguing that the existing examples were not authentic medieval instruments but were instead assembled from unrelated pieces of old armor and ironwork in the 18th or 19th century, possibly for the entertainment of museum visitors fascinated by Gothic horror. Whether or not the specific surviving examples are genuine, the design concept represents a particular logic of execution taken to its extreme. The interior spikes were positioned not to kill instantly upon the door's closing, but to puncture the eyes, pierce the limbs, and penetrate the torso just deeply enough to cause slow internal hemorrhaging. The victim would be sealed in total darkness, unable to move without driving the spikes deeper, bleeding internally for hours or potentially days. Even if the Iron Maiden as a widespread practice is more legend than documented history, it crystallized something real about how people across many eras imagined the ideal punishment, one that transformed the condemned's own body into the instrument of their suffering. The gas chamber and electric chair. Every era tends to believe it has finally made execution clean. The electric chair, introduced in New York in 1890 and first used on William Kemmler that same year, was promoted by its advocates as a modern, scientific alternative to hanging, instantaneous, painless, and dignified in the way that only technology could be. The reality was frequently different. Electrocution sometimes required multiple applications, and witnesses recorded burning flesh, violent physical convulsions, and deaths that took far longer than the official narrative suggested. The gas chamber, introduced in Nevada in 1924, used hydrogen cyanide to cause death by preventing cells from using oxygen, essentially suffocating the body at a cellular level while the person remained outwardly conscious for the initial moments. Both methods were marketed with the same philosophical promise, that the state could take a life without cruelty, that execution could be transformed into something closer to medicine than to punishment. Lethal injection, which gradually replaced both methods across most American states in the late 20th century, continued this exact same pattern, presenting death by chemical injection as clinical, sterile, and humane, a procedure rather than a killing. The recurring theme across the entire arc of execution history, from the brazen bull to the hospital gurney, is that every civilization believes its method of killing is the rational one, and that all the ones before it were barbaric. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now.